The bottle was empty when Jack Brennan opened his eyes. He knew this without looking because his hand still rested on its neck, fingers curled loose around glass gone warm in the Michigan November cold. The trailer smelled of old cigarettes and older regret, a scent that had become so familiar it no longer registered as anything but the air he breathed. 52 years old and waking on a floor he could not remember lying down on. This was what remained. Somewhere beyond the thin aluminum walls a dog barked. Traffic moved on the distant highway, that constant industrial hum of a city that had long since stopped pretending it cared who stayed and who left. Detroit in its diminished hours. Jack pushed himself upright, joints protesting, and for a moment sat very still in the gray light that filtered through curtains he had stopped washing months ago. His phone said 6:43. He was late. The landscaping job started at 7. $20 an hour to rake leaves at a development where houses sold for what he used to make in a year back when the plant was running. Back when he had a mortgage and a wife and a son who looked at him with something other than careful disappointment. The foreman would dock him for being late, probably fire him if he smelled the whiskey. Jack stood, tested his balance, found it adequate. The bathroom mirror showed a face he recognized less each time. Grayer, thinner, eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. He made it to the job site 17 minutes late. The foreman said nothing, just pointed at the section that needed clearing. Jack worked in silence, raking brown leaves into piles that the wind immediately scattered, repeating the process until his back ached and his hands cramped. Mindless work, the kind that left too much room for thinking. He tried not to think about the bottle waiting in the truck. Tried not to count the hours until he could reasonably pour the first drink of the evening without admitting he had a problem. Failed at both. His phone rang at 10:30, vibrating against his hip. Unknown number. He almost did not answer. Unknown numbers meant collection agencies or worse, people from the life he had left behind wanting something he could not give. But his hands were numb and he needed the break, so he pulled off his work glove and pressed the screen. The voice on the other end was professional, distant, a woman who had made this kind of call before and felt nothing about it. She said her name, said she was calling from a law office in Montana, a town whose name meant nothing to Jack. Said she was sorry for his loss and did he have a moment to discuss estate matters. Jack stood very still in the cold morning air. Estate matters. The words felt foreign. She said his grandfather had passed away. Said the funeral had already taken place, 6 days prior. Said there had been a will and his presence was requested for the reading, or if he could not attend, arrangements could be made to handle things remotely. She spoke carefully, as if reading from a script designed to deliver bad news to people who might not take it well. He asked when it happened. She told him. November 7th. Jack counted backward. 6 days ago he had been drinking at a bar whose name he could not remember, celebrating nothing, mourning nothing, simply existing in the space between sober and unconscious. His grandfather had died and no one had called. No one had thought to mention it. He asked if she was certain she had the right person. She confirmed his name, his date of birth, his last known address. Said his grandfather, Robert Brennan, also known as Dutch, had specifically named him in the will. Said the reading was scheduled for November 15th, 3 days from now. Said she understood it was short notice but the estate needed to be settled and would he be able to attend. Jack looked at the leaves scattered across the lawn. Looked at his truck parked at the curb, brake lights still broken, inspection sticker 8 months expired. Looked at his hands, scarred and calloused and shaking slightly in the cold. Montana was 1,200 miles away. He had $67 in his bank account and a gas tank sitting just above empty. He told her he would be there. The foreman fired him when he asked for time off. Not unexpected. There were 10 men who would take the job by afternoon, men more desperate or more sober or simply younger and willing to work harder for less. Jack loaded his tools into the truck bed and drove back to the trailer park without stopping for the bottle. Not out of virtue. He needed the $67 for gas. He had not spoken to his grandfather in 40 years. Not since he was 12 and the family stopped making the summer drive to Montana, stopped pretending they cared about the old man who lived too far from civilization, and refused every reasonable request to move closer, to sell the property, to act like a normal person who understood the value of money and comfort and fitting in. Jack remembered fragments. The smell of wood smoke clinging to worn flannel. Hands that were always warm despite the cold. A forge burning orange in the dim interior of a building he had thought was just a barn. His grandfather showing him how to start a fire, how to shape metal, how to be patient when everything in you wanted to rush. Then his grandmother had died and something in the family had broken. His father had argued with Dutch about the funeral, about money, about land that should have been sold decades ago. The visits stopped. The phone calls became rare, then non-existent. Dutch became the grandfather they did not talk about, the embarrassment, the old man who lived in the middle of nowhere doing God knew what while the rest of them moved on with their lives. Jack had been too young to understand the details. Old enough to feel the absence. He packed what little he owned, clothes that fit in a single duffel bag, toiletries, the bottle he had been avoiding, wrapped in a towel and placed carefully in the bottom of the bag where it would not break. He told himself he would not drink it, believed the lie just enough to bring it anyway, left the keys to the trailer on the counter with a note for the landlord. 1 month behind on rent, not worth the fight. The drive west took 2 days. Jack pushed the truck as hard as it would go, stopping only for gas he could barely afford and bathroom breaks at rest stops where he washed his face in sinks that smelled of industrial cleaner and studied his reflection with something approaching honesty. This was what his grandfather would see if he were alive. This was what he had become. 52 years old, divorced, unemployed, carrying everything he owned in a vehicle held together by rust and stubbornness. A veteran who had survived Iraq but could not survive peace. An engineer who had built bridges in combat zones but could not build a life that held together. Montana appeared gradually. The landscape changed from flat Midwest farmland to rolling plains, from towns clustered tight along highways to spaces so vast the towns became suggestions, a gas station, and 3 houses calling themselves a community. The mountains rose in the distance, snow-capped and indifferent. Jack felt something loosen in his chest as the cities fell away, felt the noise of his life dim to something manageable. By the time he crossed the state line, his hands had stopped shaking. The law office was in a county seat whose population could have fit inside a single Detroit factory. Main Street ran 4 blocks, half the storefronts empty, the other half selling things no one urgently needed. Hardware, antiques, a diner that looked like it had not changed since 1970. Jack parked in front of a 2-story brick building that proclaimed itself home to 3 businesses, one of which was Porter and Associates, attorneys at law. He was early, sat in the truck for 20 minutes watching people move along the sidewalk with the unhurried pace of those who had nowhere urgent to be. A woman walked a dog. An old man carried groceries. 2 teenagers stood outside the hardware store, talking and laughing about something Jack could not hear, normal life, the kind he had forgotten existed. At 5 minutes before the appointed time, he went inside. The waiting room smelled of old paper and carpet cleaner. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and professionally set hair, looked up as he entered, asked his name, smiled with the sort of warmth reserved for people she pitied, told him to have a seat, the others would be arriving shortly. Others, Jack had not considered there would be others. They arrived together. His brother Richard, 58 now, gray at the temples and dressed in clothes that cost more than Jack's truck. His sister Margaret, 60, wearing a coat that looked new and carrying a purse that probably was. They saw him and stopped, just for a moment. Then Richard's face settled into something carefully neutral, and Margaret managed a smile that did not reach her eyes. Richard said his name, not as a greeting, as a confirmation, as if he had been expecting someone else. Jack nodded, said it was good to see them, meant none of it. Margaret moved forward, offered a half embrace that involved no actual contact, said she was glad he could make it, that it had been too long, that they should talk after this was done. Her voice had the practiced quality of someone who made uncomfortable small talk for a living. She was good at it, always had been. Richard did not bother with pretense, took a seat across the small room and checked his phone. Margaret sat beside him. They did not ask Jack how he was, did not ask where he was staying or how the drive had been or what he had been doing for the past 3 years since the divorce. The silence that filled the room was the silence of people who had made their assessments long ago and saw no reason to revisit them. The attorney appeared at precisely 2 o'clock. A man in his 40s, professionally pleasant, the kind of lawyer who handled wills and property disputes and probably knew everyone in town by their first name. He introduced himself as Jim Porter, shook hands with each of them, and led them into a conference room that was too large for 3 people. The will was straightforward. Porter read it with the practiced cadence of someone who had read many wills, his voice rising and falling in the rhythm of legal language that meant everything and nothing. Dutch had not been a wealthy man by conventional measures, but he had accumulated property and possessions over 84 years of living, and now those things needed to go somewhere. Richard received the ranch house, a structure Porter described as 4 bedrooms on 200 acres of prime grazing land near the county highway. Came with equipment, water rights, and what remained of the cattle operation Dutch had run until 10 years prior. Market value estimated at $700,000, possibly more given recent land appreciation in the area. Richard nodded as if he had expected this. Probably had. Margaret received the vacation cabin, a property near a lake that had been in the family since the 30s. Came with an investment portfolio, stocks and bonds that Dutch had quietly accumulated over decades. Total value approximately $180,000. Margaret smiled softly, touched her eyes with a tissue, said something about memories and how their grandfather had always loved that cabin. Then Porter said Jack's name. The room became very quiet. Porter adjusted his glasses, looked down at the document, read the words exactly as written. Jack was to receive the old blacksmith property and all structures located thereon, approximately 40 acres situated on North County Road 7, including all contents, personal effects, and rights associated with said property. The silence that followed felt heavy. Richard made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a cough, something in between that conveyed exactly what he thought of this arrangement. Porter continued, describing the property in the measured language of legal documents. No utilities connected. No maintained road access for the final mile. Structure described as barn with attached workshop. Condition unknown. Uninhabited for the past 6 months while Dutch had been in hospice care. Estimated value difficult to determine given location and state of disrepair. Margaret looked at Jack with something that might have been sympathy, might have been pity, probably both. Richard leaned back in his chair, said nothing, did not need to. Porter finished reading, asked if there were any questions. Richard asked about taxes, about timelines, about what happened if someone wanted to contest. Porter answered each question with professional patience. Margaret asked about personal items, photographs, things of sentimental value. Porter said those had been distributed according to Dutch's specific instructions, most going to various veterans organizations, some to neighbors, a few items held for each of them. No one asked Jack if he had questions. No one looked at him directly. The meeting ended. Richard stood immediately, already reaching for his phone. Margaret lingered, touched Jack's arm with 2 fingers, said again that they should talk. Said she was staying at the hotel in town if he needed anything. Said it with the tone of someone who hoped he would not need anything. They left together. Jack remained seated, staring at the folder Porter had given him. Inside was a deed, a hand-drawn map, and a property description that told him almost nothing about what he had actually inherited. Porter sat back down, asked if Jack had somewhere to stay. Jack said he had his truck. Porter's face did something complicated. He reached into his desk, pulled out a key on a simple metal ring, slid it across the table. Said this was for the property. Said Dutch had left it with the office 6 months ago when he went into hospice. Said the old man had been very specific about who should receive what, had spent considerable time making sure everything was documented properly, had seemed to care a great deal that things were done right. Jack took the key, asked how Dutch had died. Porter said it was his heart. Said he had gone peacefully in his sleep at the hospice facility in Billings. Said he had been 84 and his body had simply worn out. Said there had been a small service, just a few neighbors and people from the VFW, nothing formal. Said Dutch had requested cremation, had asked that his ashes be scattered on the property. Jack asked if anyone had scattered them yet. Porter said no. Said they had been waiting to see if family wanted to be present. Said he had them in his office if Jack wanted to take them. Jack said he did. Porter left the room, returned with a simple wooden box, no larger than a shoebox, sealed with a brass latch. Handed it to Jack with both hands, a gesture of respect. Jack held his grandfather's remains and felt nothing, then felt everything, then felt nothing again. He left the office as afternoon shadows stretched across Main Street, put the box carefully on the passenger seat of his truck, studied the map Porter had given him. The property was 2 hours north, most of it on paved roads, but the last stretch marked with a dotted line that suggested something less reliable. He drove. The highway gave way to county roads. The county roads gave way to gravel. The gravel gave way to 2 ruts separated by brown grass, a path that had once been maintained but now existed only because someone had driven it enough times to wear the earth into submission. Jack's truck complained over rocks and through mud frozen hard by November cold. Pines crowded closer. The sky opened wider. He had not seen this much space in years, had forgotten what it felt like to be this far from everything. The structure appeared without warning. One moment he was navigating ruts between trees. The next he was in a clearing, and there it was. A barn, large, weathered, gray wood darkened by decades of weather. Metal roof rusted at the edges but intact. Stone foundation rising 4 feet, solid as the day it was laid. Small outbuildings nearby, most collapsed into themselves, reclaimed by time and gravity. No house visible. No other structures standing except the barn itself. Jack stopped the truck, turned off the engine, sat in the silence that followed. This was what he had inherited. This was what his grandfather had chosen to leave him while his siblings received houses and investments and things that could be easily converted into comfort. Jack considered the way Richard had reacted, the way Margaret had looked at him with that careful sympathy. They had known, had probably seen this property, had probably driven away grateful they had received anything else. He got out of the truck. The cold hit him immediately, sharper than Michigan cold, cleaner somehow. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water. No traffic noise, no machinery, no voices, just wind and trees and the creak of old wood adjusting to the temperature. Jack walked the perimeter slowly. The barn was bigger up close than it had seemed from the truck, maybe 40 feet wide and 60 long. Proper timber frame construction, mortise and tenon joints visible where boards had fallen away. The foundation was impressive. Cut stone fitted so precisely that mortar seemed almost unnecessary. Someone had known what they were doing. Someone had built this to last. Behind the main structure lay the remains of what might have been a blacksmith shop. An anvil sat there still, 700 pounds of iron rusted but unmoved by anything less than deliberate effort. The forge structure remained mostly intact, its chimney still standing, its firebox protected by a lean-to that had somehow survived when everything else fell. Coal sat in a pile nearby, weathered by rain but covered enough that the bottom layers might still burn. Evidence of recent use. The coal was not completely degraded. The tools, while rusted, were organized deliberately. Someone had been here not long ago. Someone had cared enough to protect things. Jack approached the barn door. Heavy wood hung on iron hinges that had been forged by hand. He could see the hammer marks. The door resisted when he pulled, settled into its frame by decades of small movements, but it gave with a groan that echoed into the dim interior. The smell reached him first. Old hay, weathered wood, ash and oil and something else, something lived in that he could not quite name. He stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the reduced light. Gaps in the boards allowed thin streams of daylight to cut through the darkness, illuminating dust that drifted in slow currents. He expected empty space, expected the hollow shell that barns became when their purpose ended. He found walls. Not the walls of the barn itself, though those stood around him weathered and strong. These were different walls built inside the larger structure, forming a complete building within the protective shell of the barn. A cabin, 20 feet wide, maybe 24 feet long, constructed with care and precision in the exact center of the barn's interior. 8 feet of clearance on all sides. An air gap. Insulation. Protection. Jack walked around it slowly, his boots loud on the packed earth floor. The cabin walls were tight-fitted boards, overlapping slightly, leaving almost no visible gaps. Small windows, shuttered from inside. A door with an iron latch that looked hand-forged. This was not storage. This was not afterthought. This was engineered shelter built by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. He approached the door. The latch was cold under his hand but moved smoothly, well maintained despite years of use. The key from Porter fit the lock, turned with a click that sounded too loud in the quiet space. Jack pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air changed immediately. Still cold but different, held. The smell was stronger here. Wood smoke, oil, metal, living smells, not the decay he had expected. His eyes adjusted to the dimness. A single room. Stone floor, each stone fitted by hand into a surface that was uneven but deliberate. A wood stove stood in the center, its chimney rising through the cabin roof and then through the barn roof above, a double wall system that would draw smoke efficiently while retaining heat. Simple furniture, all built in. A bunk along one wall, its frame mortised into the structure itself. A table, 2 benches. Shelves covering another wall, organized with the precision of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. The bunk held blankets, folded military style, tight corners, precise edges. A cup sat on the table, turned upside down to keep dust out, reading glasses beside it. The stove had been cleaned after its last use, ashes removed, surfaces wiped down. This was not abandoned. This was maintained. Jack moved to the shelves. Books lined them. Engineering texts, metalworking manuals, homesteading guides, and notebooks. Dozens of them, leather-bound, stacked in chronological order by dates written on their spines. Beside them, wooden boxes and cloth-wrapped bundles, organized by size and purpose. A storage bench ran along the back wall, its lid fitted so precisely it took him a moment to realize it was not part of the floor. He lifted the lid. Inside, neatly folded, were clothes, work shirts, denim pants, a heavy coat, all worn but clean, below them tools, a level, square, measuring tape, chisel set, everything a person would need to build or maintain or repair, everything organized as if the owner might return at any moment and need to find something in the dark. Jack sat on the bunk. It did not creak. Solid construction, boards that had been planed and fitted with care. He looked around the space, really seeing it now, every detail considered, every surface smoothed by hand, every joint fitted to last. This was not a shelter thrown together in desperation. This was a home built with the same precision as the barn that protected it. His grandfather had lived here, not just survived here, lived. Jack reached for the nearest notebook. The leather cover was soft with age and handling. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was strong and angular, written with the careful precision of someone who valued clarity. The date said October 1978. 47 years ago. Jack would have been 5. The first entry was brief, matter-of-fact, clinical in its description of circumstances. Richard had called Dutch crazy for refusing to sell to the highway expansion. Margaret had not called in 3 months. Money had gone to medical bills for Jack's grandmother. The house had gone to the bank. Dutch had this land, these hands, and what he had learned in Korea about surviving when everything else was gone. That would have to be enough. Jack read the words 3 times, tried to imagine his grandfather writing them, tried to imagine the man who had lost everything but refused to see it as loss, who had looked at a barn and seen possibility, who had taken combat survival skills and adapted them to Montana winter. He turned pages, read entries that spanned months, watched his grandfather's voice emerge from ink on paper, watched him describe building the inner cabin board by board, explain why double-wall construction worked, how thermal mass stored heat, why positioning mattered. Every decision documented, every lesson learned recorded with the precision of an engineer who knew others might need this knowledge someday. Jack lost track of time. The light fading through the window shutters went from gray to amber to the deep blue of twilight. His stomach reminded him he had not eaten since breakfast. His body reminded him it was cold, but he kept reading, could not stop. His grandfather had built this place alone, had engineered it using principles learned in combat, refined through trial and error, perfected over years of solitary winters, had created a system that required minimal fuel but provided maximum protection, had documented everything with the care of someone who understood knowledge was the only thing worth passing down. When Jack finally closed the notebook, darkness had fully settled. He stood, stretched muscles stiff from sitting, and realized he had made a decision without consciously making it. He was not leaving, not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either. He returned to the truck, retrieved his duffel bag, the box containing his grandfather's ashes, carried them into the cabin, found a lantern on the shelf, oil still in its reservoir, wick trimmed and ready, matches in a waterproof container beside it. He lit the lantern. Warm light filled the small space, pushing shadows into corners. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Jack could feel it even through the barn and cabin walls. Still, inside the cabin the air felt different. Cold, yes, but not the aggressive cold of exposure. This was containable cold, manageable. He found firewood stacked outside the cabin door but still within the barn's protection. Split and seasoned, organized by size. He selected pieces appropriate for starting a fire, following half-remembered lessons from childhood. Build the base. Create air flow. Small to large. Let it breathe. It took 3 attempts. His hands shook. He had to stop twice and steady himself. But on the 3rd try the kindling caught. Smoke rose cleanly up the chimney. Flames found purchase on the larger pieces. Heat began to radiate from the iron stove. Within an hour the cabin had warmed noticeably. Not comfortable, Not what most people would call warm, but survivable, livable. The stone floor, cold when he first entered, now felt different beneath his boots. Still cool, but with a quality that suggested it was absorbing heat, storing it against the long night ahead. Jack sat on the bunk, removed his boots, lay back against the wall with a blanket pulled over his legs. The notebook rested on his chest. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Inside, fire crackled softly in the stove. The lantern flame cast shifting shadows on the walls. He considered the bottle in his duffel bag. How easy it would be to open it, to pour away the thoughts that crowded his mind, to find that temporary nothing that whiskey promised. His hand actually moved toward the bag. Stopped. He looked around the cabin, at the precision of every surface, at the evidence of discipline and patience and refusal to accept defeat. His grandfather had built this sober, had survived here sober, had documented it all with a clear mind and steady hands. Jack left the bottle where it was. He picked up the notebook again, read by lantern light as the cabin warmed and the night deepened. Read about the first winter, about mistakes made and corrected, about cold that tested everything and walls that held. Read his grandfather's voice speaking across decades, teaching lessons that had nothing to do with construction and everything to do with endurance. Sleep found him somewhere near midnight. The lantern had burned low. The fire in the stove had settled into coals that would last until morning. Jack's last conscious thought was that, for the first time in months, he was not afraid of his dreams. He slept without nightmares, woke to gray light filtering through shutter gaps and the cabin still holding warmth from the banked fire. His phone showed 6:15. He had messages, did not check them. Jack stood, stretched, added wood to the stove. The coals caught immediately. He had done it right. Outside, frost covered everything in a thin white layer that would burn off when the sun rose higher. Inside, the cabin remained a constant temperature, protected by design and intention and the ghost of a man who had refused to let winter win. Jack made coffee on the stove using supplies he found in the storage bench. Instant grounds in a metal cup, water from a jug he assumed came from the well his grandfather had mentioned in the notebook. It tasted better than it should have. He stood by the window, looking out through gaps in the shutters at a landscape he barely remembered. His phone vibrated, text message, Richard. Frank Holloway offering $85,000 for property as is. You should take it. Nothing out there worth keeping. Jack looked around the cabin, at notebooks stacked on shelves, at tools organized with care, at a stove burning steady and walls that had protected a man through 40 Montana winters, at his grandfather's life reduced to what Richard saw as nothing. He texted back, "Need time to go through things." The response came immediately, "Don't be stupid. It's a barn and junk. Take the money." Jack put the phone away, opened the second notebook, started reading about the forge, about learning to work metal again, about finding purpose in creation when everything else had been taken away. By mid-morning he had made his decision, not consciously, not in a moment of revelation. It simply settled into him the way heat had settled into the stone floor, gradual, inevitable, right. He was not leaving yet. Maybe not at all. The barn was not nothing. The cabin was not junk. This inheritance was not what Richard thought it was. His grandfather had not left him property, had not left him money or land value or something to be converted into comfort. Dutch had left him a test, a question, a chance. Jack stood in the cabin that his grandfather had built with careful hands and patient years. Stood in the proof that a man could lose everything and still build something that mattered. Stood in the space between who he had been and who he might become. Outside, November wind tested the barn walls. Inside, the cabin held firm. Jack picked up the third notebook and began to read. The notebooks became Jack's companions. He read them in sequence, following his grandfather's voice through years that unfolded in careful handwriting on pages yellowed by time and handling. Each entry was dated, some precisely, others marked only by season or weather. Dutch had not been writing for an audience. He had been documenting, the way an engineer documents a build, recording what worked and what failed so the next attempt could be better. The early years covered construction. October 1978 through the winter of 1979, Dutch described building the inner cabin with methodical detail. Why he positioned it exactly center in the barn's footprint, leaving 8 feet of clearance on all sides. How that air gap created a buffer zone where cold could not penetrate directly, had to work its way through multiple barriers, losing force with each one. He wrote about the stone floor like a man describing a living thing. Each rock selected for size and thermal properties, laid in a pattern that allowed heat absorption during the day, slow release through the night. The stones were not decoration. They were battery storage for warmth. The wood stove placement had taken Dutch 3 attempts. He documented each failure. First position too close to the north wall created uneven heating. Second position near the door lost too much warmth when entering or leaving. Third attempt, dead center, chimney rising straight through both roofs with minimal bends, drawing smoke efficiently while radiating heat in all directions. That one had worked. 40 years later, it still worked. Jack read about the ventilation system Dutch had engineered. Small vents near the ceiling, angled to pull stale air out without creating drafts at floor level. Fresh air intake near the stove, warmed before it circulated. The man had thought about air flow the way most people thought about furniture placement, as something that mattered, as something that could kill you if you got it wrong. The well had been hand-dug. August 1979, when the ground was driest and digging easiest, 22 feet down before Dutch hit water. He had lined it with stone, built a hand pump from salvaged parts, installed filtration using sand and charcoal layered in a barrel. The water was cold and clean and had never run dry. 45 years of reliability from one summer's careful work. Jack sat at the table, his grandfather's table, reading by lantern light as another November day faded outside. He had been here 4 days now, had not left the property, had not called his siblings back, had barely looked at his phone except to see the messages pile up. Richard demanding answers, Margaret asking if he was okay, if he needed help, if he had thought about the offer. He had not thought about the offer. Had thought about nothing but these notebooks and what they revealed about a man he had barely known. The middle years showed a different Dutch. 1985 through 1995, the construction phase complete, the survival phase proven. His grandfather had resumed blacksmithing, not as hobby, as vocation. The entries became technical, describing metalworking projects with the same precision he had used for the cabin. Wrought iron gates for a rancher 30 miles south. Fireplace tools for a family in town. Repairs on equipment that farmers brought him, trusting his fair prices and honest work. He had lived on almost nothing. $400 a month, the entries said, bought staples in bulk, grew vegetables in summer, hunted in fall, bartered metalwork for beef and chicken, saved every dollar that did not go directly to survival, paid cash for everything, refused credit, accumulated money the old way slowly by spending less than he earned and wanting nothing he did not need. The family appeared in these entries as ghosts, brief mentions that carried weight. Richard had visited once in 1987, had stayed 20 minutes, had called the property an embarrassment. Margaret had sent a Christmas card in 1990, generic message, no personal note. Jack's father, Dutch's son, had died in 1994. Dutch had learned about it 3 weeks after the funeral. No one had called. He had written a single sentence about it. My son is gone and I heard from strangers. This is what I built. Jack closed that notebook and sat in silence. The stove burned steady. Wind moved through the pines outside. He reflected on his own son, on Tommy deployed somewhere Jack was not cleared to know, on the distance that had grown between them over the years. Geography was only part of it. The rest came from choices, from bottles, from weakness. He opened the next notebook. The entry that stopped him was dated November 27, 1990. The handwriting was different, heavier, written with force that had nearly torn the paper. The anniversary of something. Dutch wrote about being 41 years ago to that day. Chosin Reservoir, Korea, November 1950. Jack had known his grandfather served in Korea, had not known the details. The family did not talk about it. Dutch himself had never mentioned it during those brief childhood summers. It was simply a fact, acknowledged and filed away. Now Jack read and understood why silence had been necessary. They had been surrounded. 15,000 men, cut off by Chinese forces in mountain terrain where November temperatures reached 35 below zero. Command had ordered them to hold position. Dutch and the other engineers had known better. Staying meant freezing to death in foxholes that could not be dug deep enough in frozen ground. They had to fight their way out while building shelter every night, improvising from whatever materials they could scavenge or carry. The men who survived, Dutch wrote, were not the strongest or the bravest. They were the ones who understood that cold was patient. You could not fight it directly, could not overcome it through willpower or weapons. You had to redirect it, slow it down, outlast it through technique and discipline, and the knowledge that warmth was not about heat, but about preventing heat loss. Dutch described building shelters from vehicle wreckage and parachute silk, heating rocks in fires and wrapping them in fabric to carry warmth through the night, creating windbreaks from ammunition crates, learning which position to sleep in that minimized exposure while allowing quick movement if attacked. Every technique born from necessity. Every lesson paid for in frostbite and lost toes and men who fell asleep and did not wake. He had made it out. 17 days of fighting retreat through mountain passes, building and abandoning shelter every night, staying alive through engineering and adaptation. Had come home with knowledge most men would never need. Had filed it away. Had spent 30 years as a blacksmith and husband and father, those lessons dormant. Then the bank had taken the house, and winter had come and Dutch had looked at a barn, and known exactly what to do. The cabin was not homesteader ingenuity. It was combat engineering adapted for Montana. Every technique had battlefield origin. The double-wall insulation based on emergency bunker construction. The stone floor thermal mass learned from heated rock shelters. The minimal fuel usage born from rationed heating oil in Korea. The ventilation preventing carbon monoxide, which had killed men in sealed positions who thought they were safe. Jack read the entry 3 times, felt something shift in how he understood this place. His grandfather had not been playing at survival, had not been stubborn or eccentric or any of the things the family had called him. Dutch had been applying hard-won knowledge to circumstances that required it, had been doing what he was trained to do: adapt, endure, build what was needed from what was available. Jack stood and walked outside. The November afternoon was cold and clear. He studied the barn with new eyes, saw the north wall reinforced with extra boards, understood that was the prevailing wind direction, the side that needed most protection. Saw how the barn sat slightly into the land rather than on top of it, using the earth itself as insulation. Saw the way Dutch had oriented everything to maximize southern exposure, minimize northern vulnerability. This was a fortification, built by a combat engineer who had survived the worst winter warfare of the 20th century. Built to the same standard that had kept him alive when thousands had frozen to death around him. Jack felt inadequate in a way he had not felt before. He was Army too, had served in Iraq, had built bridges under fire and cleared routes through hostile territory. But he had never been tested like Chosin, had never had to engineer survival in conditions that killed through cold as efficiently as combat. His grandfather had done both, had carried that knowledge for decades, had used it to build this place, had lived here 40 years proving the design worked. And Jack had almost sold it for $85,000 simply because his brother said it was junk. He returned to the cabin and started reading faster, consuming entries that documented years in hours. Watched his grandfather's voice evolve from technical documentation to something closer to philosophy. The later notebooks, 2000s and 2010s, contained fewer measurements and more observations. Dutch wrote about silence, about how much noise city life contained and how that noise prevented thought. Wrote about work, about the satisfaction of shaping metal or wood with your own hands, creating something that had not existed before. Wrote about freedom, not as political concept but as daily reality. The freedom of owing nothing, needing little, answering to no one. He wrote about family, about watching his children chase success and comfort and status, about trying to explain that those things were not worth what they cost, about being dismissed as old-fashioned, out of touch, too stubborn to understand modern life. Dutch had not argued, had simply stopped trying, had chosen his land and his work and his solitude over relationships that required him to pretend he wanted what he did not want. Jack understood that now, understood it in a way he could not have a week ago. Before the divorce he had chased the same things: house in the suburbs, new car every few years, keeping up with neighbors who were keeping up with other neighbors in an endless race toward a finish line that kept moving. He had lost his marriage trying to provide things his wife did not actually need, had lost himself in the process, had found whiskey as compensation for a life that felt empty no matter how full the garage was. His grandfather had skipped all of that, had gone straight to the part where you figured out what actually mattered, had spent 40 years living the answer. The physical work began on the 5th day. Jack could not just read anymore. His hands needed occupation. He started with simple maintenance, following instructions from the notebooks like they were technical manuals. Cleared drainage around the barn foundation. Water management was critical, Dutch had written. Water finds every weakness, freezes and expands, destroys what took years to build. Keep it moving, keep it away. Jack found the tools where the notebook said they would be: shovel, pickaxe, rake, all maintained, edges sharp, handles tight. He dug shallow trenches to redirect runoff, cleared debris from downspouts he had not noticed at first, gutters that fed rainwater away from the foundation into gravel beds that percolated it slowly into the ground. The system was simple but effective. 40 years without foundation damage proved it. He repaired barn boards next. Some had split with age, needed replacing. The notebook from 1998 described Dutch's process. Never replace a board that just needs reinforcement. Wood that has weathered 40 years has earned its place. Reinforce with strips, seal with tar, let it continue serving. Only replace what is truly failed. Jack found the lumber stash, boards cut and stored under tarps already seasoned. Found the tar bucket, the galvanized nails, the hammer worn smooth by his grandfather's hand. The work was meditative. Measure twice, cut once, fit carefully, secure firmly, no rushing, no shortcuts. Do it right or do it again. His hands steadied as he worked. The tremor that had become constant over the last year faded. He noticed it 3rd day of repairs, holding a board in place, nail position just right, hammer coming down clean and true. His hands were not shaking, had not shaken all day. He looked at them like they belonged to someone else. Scarred, calloused, steady. He had not touched the bottle, had thought about it. Had opened the duffel bag twice, looked at the towel-wrapped shape, closed the bag again. Work exhausted him too thoroughly for drinking. Sleep came natural and deep. Dreams, when they came, were about building things, fitting pieces together, creating structures that would last. The truck appeared on the 8th day. Jack was splitting firewood behind the barn when he heard the engine, diesel rattle carrying across the clear air. He set down the axe and walked around front as a Ford from the 1990s parked beside his own vehicle. The man who stepped out was old in the way that ranchers aged, weathered and lean, and moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to waste energy. 65, maybe older. He wore work clothes that were clean but not new, boots that had been resoled twice, a canvas jacket that looked like it might have been his father's. He looked at Jack for a long moment before speaking. Then he said Jack's name, not a question, a confirmation. Jack nodded. The man said his name was Frank Holloway, said he owned the ranch that bordered this property to the east, said he was sorry about Dutch, said he had been meaning to come by, wanted to see if Jack needed anything, wanted to pay his respects to a good man gone. They shook hands. Frank's grip was firm, his palm hard with decades of work. He looked past Jack at the barn, at the repairs already visible, at the woodpile growing beside the split rounds. "You've been busy," Frank said. "Learning the place," Jack replied. Frank nodded slowly, said he had known Dutch 40 years, said they had helped each other when times were hard, the way neighbors did out here, said Dutch had been quiet but solid. The kind of man who showed up when you needed help and never mentioned it afterward. The kind who kept his word and expected others to do the same. Jack asked if Frank wanted to see inside. Frank said he had been inside plenty of times over the years, but would appreciate seeing it again if Jack did not mind the company. They walked to the barn together. Frank stopped at the door, ran his hand over the wood frame, studied the hinges. "He made these," Frank said, "forged them himself. 1978-79. I helped him hang the door. Took us 6 hours to get it right." Inside, Frank moved through the space with familiarity, touched the cabin walls, looked up at the ventilation system, nodded approval at repairs Jack had made. "You've got good hands," Frank said. "Dutch mentioned that. Said you were the only one who listened when he tried to teach you things." Jack was surprised. "He talked about me." "Sometimes, not often. But when he did, he said you had potential, said you paid attention, said you might understand someday what he was trying to show you." They sat at the table inside the cabin. Jack made coffee on the stove. Frank accepted the cup with both hands, held it for warmth. "Your family been calling you?" Frank asked. "Every day. Pressure you to sell." Jack looked at him. "How did you know?" Frank smiled without humor. "I'm the one who's been asking about this land for 20 years. Dutch told me if anything happened to him, if whoever inherited wanted to sell, he hoped I would be the buyer. Said he trusted me to keep it wild." "Why do you want it?" "I don't, not for myself. I know what it is, what it's worth, and I know what happens if the wrong people get it." He sipped coffee, looked around the cabin. "This land sits on one of the largest aquifers in Montana," Frank said. "Underground water that feeds 3 river systems, controls access to millions of gallons. The property also sits on the old railway right-of-way that expired back in the 50s. If highway expansion comes through like they're planning, this is the only private land on the whole route. Everyone else sold already or got bought out decades ago." Frank set down his cup. "Whoever owns this land controls development access and water rights both. Your brother knows that. The people calling him know it better. That $85,000 offer is about 1/10 what this property is actually worth, maybe less." Jack absorbed this. Richard's insistence made sudden sense. Margaret's concerned calls. The way they had both been so quick to suggest he sell, to take the money, to walk away. "Why didn't Dutch sell?" Jack asked. He knew what they would do with it: drain the aquifer, pave over everything, turn it into another strip of highway wasteland. Dutch believed some things should not be touched just for profit. He was protecting it. And now I am. Frank nodded, whether you know it or not. They sat in silence. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Inside, the stove ticked softly as metal expanded and contracted with heat. I should tell you, Frank said. I'm not the only one interested. There's a company, Development Corporation out of Denver. They've been trying to get this land for 30 years. Went through your father back in the 90s. Tried again when your father passed. Went after Dutch directly a dozen times. He fought them every time. What company? Terra West Development. They're connected. Lawyers, politicians, money. They don't take no for an answer. They'll try you too. Probably already are, just in ways you have not recognized yet. Frank stood, said he should get going, said if Jack needed anything, advice or help or just someone to talk to who understood what this land meant. Frank's ranch was 6 miles east. Gave directions, said he meant it. At the door, Frank paused. Dutch left you this place for a reason. Not the only thing he had, everything that mattered to him. You decide whether that means something to you. Jack watched the truck drive away, stood in the clearing as the sound faded and the silence returned, looked at the barn, at the repairs he had made, at the woodpile he had split, at a landscape that was empty of people but full of something else, something he did not have a name for yet but was beginning to recognize. He returned to the cabin and pulled out the notebook marked 2015, flipped through entries about maintaining systems, about a hard winter, about small victories against time and weather. Found an entry from April that year. Dutch had written about value, about how his children measured it in dollars and property and things that could be sold, about how he measured it in water that ran clean and trees that grew without permission and silence that was not empty but full, about how those two definitions could not be reconciled, about how trying to explain one to someone who believed the other was like speaking different languages. Jack reflected on his life before: the house, the car payments, the credit card debt for furniture and appliances and things he had needed simply because everyone said you needed them, how losing it all had felt like failure, how shame had driven him to drink. A man was supposed to provide, supposed to succeed, supposed to measure up. His grandfather had rejected that entire framework, had chosen deliberately to live poor by conventional measures and rich by his own, had built wealth the old way, by needing less rather than earning more. Jack moved to the storage bench, opened it, removed the top layer of clothes and tools, remembered something from the notebooks about how Dutch hid important things, not where they could not be found, where they would only be found by someone who stayed long enough to look carefully. His hands found the seam, a board that sat slightly different from the others. He pried it up carefully. The metal box underneath was waterproof, military surplus, painted green with rust at the corners, heavy when he lifted it. He carried it to the table. The latch was stiff but opened. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was cash. Stacks of $50 and $100 bills, bundled with rubber bands that had degraded but still held. Jack counted slowly. $18,000, saved over decades. Emergency money, survival money, money that Dutch had never needed, having built systems that did not require cash infusion to function. Beneath the money were documents, land surveys, water rights filings, mineral rights certificates, the original homestead papers from 1892, yellowed and brittle but legally binding. Every document proving Dutch owned this land completely, owned everything under it and over it and flowing through it. Beneath the documents were letters, envelopes addressed to Dutch from Richard and Margaret postmarked over the years, Jack opened one. Read his brother asking for money to invest in a property deal, promising returns, needing just $20,000 to get started. Dutch had never opened it, had saved it instead, evidence of what his children wanted from him. At the bottom of the box, an envelope labeled in careful script, "Jack, when you are ready." Jack's hands shook as he opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, his grandfather's handwriting, dated 6 months before his death. The letter was not long. Dutch was not a man for unnecessary words. He wrote that if Jack was reading this, he had come, had stayed, had not immediately sold the way Richard and Margaret would have. That meant something. Meant Jack might be ready to understand what Dutch was trying to give him. The land, Dutch wrote, was a test. Could Jack live here one winter, not just survive, live, really live with purpose and presence and attention? Could he do it sober? Could he do it alone? Could he learn what Dutch had learned about what actually sustained a man when comfort was stripped away? The money was for emergencies only, for medical needs or legal defense or situations where cash was the only answer. Not for ease, not for shortcuts, not for buying back the life Jack had lost, a life not worth buying back anyway. The land was worth more than Richard knew, though not for the reasons Richard would think. The aquifer and the minerals and the railway access made it valuable to corporations and developers. Its real value lay in staying untouched, in being protected, in proving that not everything had to be converted into profit. Dutch wrote that he had watched Jack struggle, had known about the war, about the PTSD, about the drinking and the divorce and the shame, had known his own version of it after Korea, had taken him years to understand that broken men could be reforged. That was what the forge taught. Heat and pressure and careful shaping could create something stronger than the original form. The cabin was school. The winter was teacher. The work was curriculum. If Jack could stay, if he could learn, if he could become who he was meant to be instead of who the world said he should be. Dutch wrote that he was proud of Jack, had always seen the potential Richard and Margaret missed, the patience, the careful hands, the ability to endure when others quit. Jack had it in him to be more than what he had settled for. The land would show him how. The letter ended simply. Your grandfather always believed you would stand when others fell. Jack read it 3 times, set it down carefully, looked around the cabin at everything his grandfather had built, at the evidence of discipline and patience and refusal to accept defeat. Something broke loose in his chest. Not tears, something deeper. The place where shame had been carrying weight for years. The place where failure had made its home. That place cracked open and light got in. He stood and walked outside. The afternoon was fading toward evening, cold settling in with the shadows. He walked to the blacksmith shop, stood looking at the forge his grandfather had built and maintained and used until the end. At the anvil that had shaped metal for 40 years, at tools hung in careful order on walls that had stood through decades of weather. Jack had not worked a forge since childhood, had watched Dutch heat metal and hammer it into new forms, had been allowed to try once or twice under careful supervision. He remembered the heat, the rhythm, the way metal glowed orange and yielded to pressure when the temperature was right but resisted when it cooled too much. Remembered his grandfather saying that metal had memory, that it remembered how it was treated. That patience shaped better than force. The coal pile had enough fuel. The bellows still held air. Jack cleaned ash from the forge bed, built a careful base of kindling and small coal, found matches in a tin that had kept them dry for years, struck one, held it to the kindling. Smoke rose first, then small flame. Jack worked the bellows gently, fed air to the fire, added larger coal piece by piece, watched the flames build and strengthen and begin to glow with the deep orange that meant real heat. It took 3 hours to get the forge properly burning. His hands remembered the work even though his mind had forgotten. The rhythm of the bellows, the reading of fire color, the patience to let heat build gradually rather than forcing it. When the forge was finally ready, when the coal bed glowed perfect orange and heat radiated in waves, Jack selected a piece of scrap steel from the pile. Nothing special, just a length of bar stock, rusted and useless as it was. He buried it in the coals, worked the bellows, watched the metal begin to change color, from rust brown to red to orange to the yellow-white that meant it was ready. He pulled it free with tongs his grandfather had forged, carried it to the anvil, raised the hammer. The first strike was awkward, arm wrong, angle off. The metal barely moved. Jack repositioned, tried again. Better. Third strike found the rhythm. Fourth strike shaped the metal. Fifth strike proved he remembered more than he thought. He worked the steel for 20 minutes, heating, hammering, reheating, learning again what his hands had known as a child. The metal yielded, took new form, became something other than scrap. When he was done, when the steel had cooled to black, he had made a simple thing. A door latch, crude but functional. He carried it to the cabin, installed it on the door. The fit was rough, but it worked. Held the door closed, would keep doing so for years if maintained properly. Jack stood back and looked at what he had made. First thing he had created in years that was not bought or borrowed or copied. Something forged by his own hands from raw material. Something that had not existed until he made it exist. His phone buzzed. Text from Richard, demanding to know if he had made a decision, saying Frank Holloway was willing to raise the offer to 100,000, saying Jack was being stupid, saying this was his last chance to do something smart with his life. Jack looked at the phone, looked at the cabin, looked at the forge still glowing in the evening darkness, looked at his hands, scarred and dirty and steadier than they had been in a year. He did not respond to Richard, put the phone away, returned to the cabin and opened another notebook, started reading about the first winter Dutch had survived here, about the cold that had tested everything, about the walls that had held, about the man who had refused to break when breaking would have been easier. Outside, November deepened toward December. The first real cold was coming. Jack could feel it in the wind, in the way the light changed, in the smell of the air. Winter was approaching. The test was beginning. He added wood to the stove, trimmed the lantern wick, settled into the bunk with the notebook and a blanket and the growing certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. The forge behind the barn still glowed orange in the darkness, heat radiating into cold air, light pushing back against night, proof that metal could be transformed, that what was broken could be reforged into something stronger. Jack read until his eyes grew heavy, slept without dreams, woke to the sound of wind testing the barn walls and the cabin holding firm against the pressure. Morning light filtered through the shutters. The stove still held warmth from the night before. He rose and added wood, made coffee, stood at the window and looked out at a landscape vast and empty and full of everything he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. His grandfather had left him more than land, had left him a map back to himself, had left him the tools and the knowledge and the space to rebuild what years of noise and hurry and wanting the wrong things had broken down. Jack was not rich, was not successful by any measure his brother would recognize, was not even technically employed. Standing in that cabin as the winter sun rose over Montana mountains, he felt wealthier than he had ever felt in his life. He had work to do, wood to split, walls to repair, systems to maintain, knowledge to absorb from 40 years of documented wisdom, a winter to survive, a man to become. He finished his coffee and stepped outside into the cold morning air, breath deep, felt it sharp in his lungs, felt alive in a way he had not felt in years. The test had begun, and Jack Brennan was ready. November surrendered to December without ceremony. The change came not in dramatic storms, but in the slow tightening of cold, the way each morning arrived a few degrees colder than the last, the way frost stopped melting by noon and simply accumulated in layers that built toward winter proper. Jack watched the transition from inside the cabin, from inside systems his grandfather had engineered to make this exact passage survivable. The double wall design worked exactly as the notebooks promised. Outside temperatures dropped into the teens at night, single digits by the third week of December. Inside the cabin, with the stove burning low and steady, the air held at 60 degrees. Not warm by most standards, not the manufactured comfort of thermostats and forced air, but livable, sustainable. The kind of temperature a man could work in, sleep in, exist in without his body spending all its energy just staying alive. Jack learned the rhythm of the stove, how much wood to add at what intervals, how to bank the fire at night so coals lasted until morning, how to read the color of flame and smoke, understanding when combustion was efficient and when it was wasting fuel. His grandfather's notes were precise about this. 3 pieces of split pine in the evening, arranged in a specific pattern that allowed air flow but prevented rapid burning. By morning, coals would remain, ready to accept new wood and flare back to life. The stone floor revealed its genius as temperatures dropped. During the day, with the stove burning, the stones absorbed heat slowly, massive thermal battery charging through hours of gradual warming. At night, when the fire burned low, those stones released their stored energy. The floor never became hot to the touch, but it never became truly cold either. Walking barefoot at 3 in the morning, Jack felt coolness but not the shocking bite of frozen ground. The stones were doing their work. Water remained accessible. The well Dutch had dug reached below the frost line. The hand pump, sheltered inside the barn, never froze. Jack developed the habit of pumping a bucket each evening, letting it sit inside the cabin overnight. By morning it was cool but not ice, ready for coffee or washing or cooking. Simple systems, reliable, proven through 40 winters before this one. He settled into routines that felt older than his own life. Wake with first light, add wood to stove, make coffee, eat simply from supplies he had driven to town to purchase. Oatmeal, dried fruit, bread when he remembered to bake it. Then work, always work, splitting wood, repairing structures, maintaining systems. The kind of labor that left him tired enough to sleep without whiskey, focused enough to avoid the thoughts that used to chase him into bottles. The notebooks from Dutch's middle years, the decades of the 90s and 2000s, contained passages written in Korean. Not many, perhaps 20 pages scattered through 15 years of journals. Jack had noticed them early but could not read the script, had assumed they were personal reflections Dutch wanted to keep private. Now, 2 weeks into December, curiosity overcame him. He photographed the pages with his phone, uploaded them to a translation service, paying $30 he could not really afford but needed to spend. The translations came back 3 days later. Jack opened the file on his phone and began to read what his grandfather had hidden in plain sight. The Korean passages were not reflections. They were testimony, detailed accounts of Dutch's time as a prisoner of war. He had been captured during the Chosin Reservoir retreat, held for 8 months in a camp where men died from cold and hunger and despair at rates that made combat casualties seem almost merciful. Dutch wrote about it clinically, recorded facts, described conditions, documented survival techniques with the same precision he would later use to document cabin construction. The camp barracks were unheated. Prisoners slept on bare floors in temperatures that regularly reached 20 below. Dutch and 3 other engineers had built hidden shelters inside the barracks, using scavenged boards and cloth scraps to create insulated spaces no larger than coffins. The guards never found them. At night, men would take turns in these shelters, warming enough to survive until morning. The men who did not have access to the shelters died, simply fell asleep and did not wake. Dutch wrote about building a water purification system from tin cans and sand, about creating heating stones by stealing rocks from a wall and warming them near the single cookfare allowed during meal distribution, about engineering ways to trap body heat using layers of newspaper salvaged from Chinese propaganda materials. Every technique born from watching men die and learning what could have saved them. He had escaped in June 1951, walked 300 miles through mountain terrain, building temporary shelters each night using principles he was developing in real time, eating almost nothing, drinking from streams he learned to identify as safe, navigating by stars and sun until he reached UN lines more dead than alive. The final Korean passage was dated 1989, nearly 40 years after his escape. Dutch wrote that he had never told anyone these details, had filed official reports but kept the deepest truths locked away, wrote them in Korean so his children would not stumble across them and ask questions he could not answer. But he needed to write them, needed to document them. The lessons learned in that camp had saved him twice, once during the escape, again when he lost everything and had to build this cabin. He wrote that the cabin was not really about cold, was about proving to himself that he could still survive what should kill him, that after everything, after war and capture and loss and aging, he could still engineer his way through conditions designed to break men. The cabin was evidence. The 40 winters were proof. He had endured worse, and he would endure this, and endurance itself was victory. Jack sat very still after reading. Snow fell outside. Wind moved through the pines. The stove burned steady. He considered his own deployment, Iraq and the things he had seen, coming home and trying to explain to people who had not been there why certain sounds made him flinch, why crowded places felt threatening, why sleep was harder than it should be. He had never been captured, had never experienced anything close to what Dutch survived, but he recognized the shape of it, the way trauma carved channels in a man's mind that never quite filled in, the way certain lessons, once learned in extremity, became permanent programming. Dutch had learned cold, had learned hunger, had learned that the only person who would save him was himself. Jack had learned noise, had learned that safety was illusion, had learned that same essential truth. The only person who would save him was himself. Different wars, same lesson, same solution. Build systems that work, maintain them, trust them, survive. His phone rang late in the afternoon on December 18th. Unknown number with a Montana area code. Jack almost did not answer, but it might be Frank or the attorney or someone who actually mattered. He accepted the call. The voice was young, male, familiar in a way that made Jack's chest tighten before his mind caught up. Dad. Tommy, his son, 26 years old and calling from somewhere Jack could not picture. Tommy never told him where he was deployed, could not tell him. Operational security prevented it. Tommy, Jack said, just the name. Could not manage more around the sudden thickness in his throat. I'm stateside, Tommy said. On leave. Uncle Richard told me you were in Montana, told me about the inheritance, said you were living out there and he was worried about you. Of course Richard had called. Of course Richard had framed it as worry. I'm fine, Jack said. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that said Tommy did not believe him, but was not going to argue yet. I'm 2 hours south, Tommy said. Drove up from the base, thought I'd come see the place, see you, if that's okay. Jack looked around the cabin, at the organized simplicity, at the evidence of sobriety and purpose, at a life that probably looked insane from the outside but felt saner than anything he had lived in years. Yeah, Jack said, that's okay. Tommy arrived 90 minutes later in a rental SUV, four-wheel drive, prepared for Montana roads. Jack watched from the cabin window as his son parked beside the truck and stepped out in civilian clothes that still somehow looked like a uniform. Military bearing that no amount of casual wear could hide. Tommy looked older than Jack remembered. Harder. The war had touched him too. They met outside, stood facing each other across 3 feet of frozen ground and 3 years of distance. Then Tommy closed the gap and they embraced. Brief. Solid. The kind of hug men gave when words were not enough but also too much. "This is it?" Tommy asked, looking at the barn. "This is it." Tommy walked the perimeter the way Jack had on first arrival, engineer's eye assessing structure, noting details. When he came to the barn door he stopped, looked at Jack with a question. "Come on," Jack said. Inside, Tommy's reaction to the inner cabin was identical to Jack's had been. Surprise, then recognition, then respect. He walked around it slowly, studied the construction, touched the walls, looked up at the ventilation system. "Dad, this is sophisticated," Tommy said. "The thermal dynamics alone. This is combat engineering." "Korean War," Jack said. "Your great-grandfather was at Chosin Reservoir, POW camp. He built this using what he learned there." Tommy stopped moving, turned to look at Jack fully. "I didn't know that. Nobody ever said." "Nobody knew. He wrote it in Korean. I had it translated." Jack showed him the notebooks, showed him the passages, watched his son read what his great-grandfather had survived and see the cabin with new understanding. This was not eccentric homesteading. This was tested knowledge applied with precision. They spent the afternoon together. Jack showed Tommy the forge, demonstrated the stove, explained the systems. Tommy understood immediately, asked technical questions, appreciated answers. This was the language they had always spoken best. Engineering, problem-solving, building things that worked. Evening came. Jack made dinner on the stove. Simple food, but more than he usually bothered with. They ate at the small table and the conversation slowly moved past technical details to harder territory. "Uncle Richard said you were wasting your inheritance," Tommy said. "Said you should sell. Said you were living in a shed with no plan." "Richard thinks anything that is not immediately profitable is waste," Jack said. "Are you drinking?" Direct question, deserved direct answer. "No," Jack said. "Haven't touched it since I got here, 5 weeks now." Tommy studied him, looking for the signs he had learned to recognize. Bloodshot eyes, shaking hands, the smell of alcohol seeping through skin. Found none of it. "You look different," Tommy said. "Better." "I feel different." "What are you going to do, long term?" Jack considered the question. A month ago he would not have had an answer, would have deflected or changed the subject or reached for a bottle rather than face the emptiness where a plan should be. "Stay," Jack said. "Learn this place, maintain it, figure out what it means." "That's not a career." "No, but it's a life." Tommy was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm getting out. End of my contract in 6 months, not re-enlisting." Jack was surprised. "Why, you love the army." "I did, but I've been thinking about what matters, about what I want to build instead of what I'm ordered to build. This." He gestured at the cabin. "What great-grandpa did here. That matters, that's legacy." They talked until late, about deployment, about what Tommy had seen, about coming home and trying to fit back into a civilian world that felt alien after combat, about the ways war changed men and the ways men tried to change back and mostly failed, found themselves somewhere in between, neither soldier nor civilian, just people carrying weight no one else could see. Around midnight Tommy stood to leave, said he had a hotel room in town, Would come back tomorrow if Jack did not mind. Stay, Jack said. Bunk's big enough for two if you don't mind close quarters. Tommy looked uncertain, then nodded. They made up the bed together, lay down in the darkness. The stove burned low. The cabin held its warmth, father and son in the same small space for the first time in years, neither sleeping right away, both aware of the other breathing in the darkness, both grateful for the shared silence. In the morning they worked together, splitting wood, repairing sections of barn wall. The rhythm came back. They had always worked well together, had built things in the garage back when Tommy was young, before deployment, before divorce, before everything went wrong. That ease returned now. Fewer words than most fathers and sons used, more understanding. Tommy left late afternoon, promised to come back before his leave ended, said he meant it. Jack believed him, watched the SUV drive away and felt something that had been clenched tight for years loosen slightly, not healed, but moving toward healing. The phone call came that evening, Margaret this time, voice tight with concern that sounded rehearsed. Jack, we need to talk about the property. What about it? Richard has been contacted by a real estate development group. They are very interested. They are willing to pay $220,000. More than double the original offer. Jack said nothing. Jack, that's life-changing money. You could get back on your feet, get treatment for the PTSD, rebuild your relationship with Tommy, move somewhere close to him, start over properly. I'm already starting over. In a barn, Jack, without heat or water or any future. That's not starting over, that's giving up. I have heat, I have water, and I'm not giving up. Margaret's voice changed, harder. We are trying to help you, we have always tried to help you. After the divorce, after you lost your job, we helped. And this is how you repay us, by being stubborn about land you cannot possibly maintain. I'm maintaining it fine. For how long? Until you start drinking again, until winter gets too hard, until you realize this fantasy of living like it's 1870 is not sustainable. Jack felt anger rise but kept his voice level. Is this about helping me or about you and Richard wanting access to money you think I am wasting? Silence. Then Margaret said quietly, you always were selfish, even when we were kids, always doing exactly what you wanted regardless of how it affected anyone else. She hung up. Jack set down the phone, looked at it like it was something unfamiliar. His sister had just called him selfish for refusing to sell land she had no claim to, for choosing to live in a way that cost her nothing but offended her sense of propriety. He returned to the notebooks, found an entry from 2003 where Dutch wrote about Margaret visiting, about her suggesting he move to assisted living, about her concern being entirely about how his choices reflected on the family. Dutch had asked her to leave, had not spoken to her again for 5 years, had written simply that some people measured love by control and were angry when control was not granted. The truck appeared 2 days before Christmas. Not Frank's familiar Ford. A new Silverado corporate clean, wrong for these roads. It parked carefully and 2 men got out. Both young, both dressed in outdoor gear that had never seen actual outdoor work. Fleece and synthetic fabrics that screamed REI catalog rather than ranch supply. Jack stepped outside. The men approached with professional smiles. Mr. Brennan, the first one said, we are with Terra West Development. We were hoping we could talk to you about your property. This is private land, Jack said. You are trespassing. We have authorization to conduct environmental surveys in this area, the second man said, pulled out a clipboard with official-looking documents. We are assessing the region for potential development and need to take some baseline measurements. Not on my land, you don't. Sir, this is just standard procedure. It won't take more than a few hours. We will be in and out and you will never know we were here." Jack looked past them at the Silverado, at the equipment in the back, soil sampling gear, survey instruments. They were not asking permission. They were announcing intention. "Get off my property," Jack said, voice quiet, absolutely firm. The first man's smile thinned. "Mr. Brennan, Terra West has invested significant resources in this regional survey. We have county permits. We have environmental clearances. We have legal authorization to conduct necessary assessments. Show me a court order specific to this property with my name on it. Until then, you have 10 minutes to pack up and leave." "Are you threatening us?" "I'm informing you, 10 minutes. Then I call the sheriff and report trespassing." The second man stepped closer, younger, more aggressive. "Listen, we are trying to do this the easy way. The company is prepared to make a very generous offer for this land. 250,000, cash, quick closing. You could be out of here by New Year." "Not interested. You are living in a barn. You have no job, no prospects. We are offering you a way out and you are going to refuse over what? Pride, stupidity." Jack felt the combat training surface, the stance that had kept him alive in Iraq, the readiness that never fully left men who had been in situations where hesitation meant death. He did not move, did not raise his voice, just let that energy show in his eyes. The second man stepped back. "Leave," Jack said, "now." They left, but the first man's parting words carried back as they climbed into the Silverado. "You are making a mistake. We will be in touch." Jack watched them drive away, pulled out his phone, called Frank. Frank answered on the second ring. Jack described what had happened. Frank was quiet for a moment. "They are escalating," Frank said. "Terra West doesn't like being told no. They will push harder now." "Let them." "Jack, I need to tell you something. 20 years ago, Dutch fought these same people. They claimed mineral rights from old homestead laws. Took him 3 years and $30,000 in legal fees to prove they had no legitimate claim. They are doing it again. To you. What do I do? You need a lawyer, good one, and you need to understand this is not going to be quick or easy." Frank gave him a name. Elena Vasquez, county clerk, veteran's widow, knew the property laws better than anyone, helped Dutch before, would help Jack if he asked. Jack called her that afternoon. Elena's voice was professional but warm. Yes, she remembered Dutch. Was sorry he had passed. Had been wondering if whoever inherited would continue his work protecting the land. "What work?" Jack asked. "Your grandfather spent the last 20 years of his life fighting development corporations, documented everything, built a legal case that was airtight. He knew what this land was worth, knew what they would do if they got it, spent his own money keeping them out." She said she would help, pro bono for a veteran, said to come to her office in town. Bring any documents Dutch had left. She would review them and advise on next steps. Jack spent Christmas alone. No calls from family, a brief text from Tommy wishing him well. He made a simple meal, sat by the stove. Read Dutch's notebook from Christmas 1979, his grandfather's first winter in the cabin, alone. No tree, no presents, no family, but warm and safe and free from obligation. Dutch had written that this was gift enough. Jack understood now. The best gift was not what you received, but what you were freed from receiving. Obligation, expectations, the weight of performing gratitude for things you did not want. He was alone, but he was free. The blizzard arrived January 3rd. Weather reports had been predicting it for a week. Major system moving down from Canada. 3 to 4 feet of snow expected. High winds. Temperatures dropping to 20 below. Roads would close, power would fail, towns would hunker down and wait it out. Jack prepared following Dutch's documented protocols, stocked extra firewood inside the barn, filled water containers, organized food supplies, checked the stove, verified the ventilation system, made sure every gap was sealed, every weakness addressed. The storm hit at noon. Wind came first, then snow, then both together in a whiteout that erased the world beyond 10 feet. Jack stood at the cabin window and watched visibility collapse. Within an hour he could not see the truck. Within 2 hours he could not see the barn walls around him. Just white, endless white, and wind that sounded like freight trains passing at intervals that shook the structure. But the cabin held. The double wall system worked exactly as designed. Wind hit the outer barn, lost force against weathered boards and structural mass. By the time it reached the inner cabin, it was reduced to whisper. Snow accumulated outside, drifted against the barn, buried everything. Inside, Jack was warm. The stove burned steady. The stone floor held heat. The air remained breathable and dry, all systems functioning as Dutch had promised they would. The storm lasted 3 days. Jack used the time to read, to think, to simply exist in the enforced stillness that blizzards created. No phone signal, no internet, no contact with the outside world, just him and the cabin and the wind that could not reach him. When the storm finally broke, when the wind died and the snow stopped and pale sunlight returned, Jack opened the cabin door to find the world transformed. Drifts 6 feet high against the barn, the truck completely buried, trees bowed under snow weight, silence so complete it felt physical. He dug out slowly, took 2 days to clear paths, to find the truck, to make the property navigable again. The work was hard but satisfying. Every shovelful of snow moved was proof he could handle what winter delivered. Frank arrived on the 4th day after the storm, his truck equipped with a plow blade, roads barely passable, but Frank knew them too well to be stopped. "You made it through," Frank said. "Not a question, a statement of respect." "The cabin works," Jack said. "I have something to show you." Frank pulled a metal box from his truck, old, military surplus, similar to the one Jack had found in the cabin. "Dutch gave this to me 5 years ago, said to give it to whoever inherited the property if they lasted 1 winter. You lasted." Jack carried the box inside, set it on the table. Frank watched as he opened it. Documents, legal files, every piece of correspondence from Dutch's decades-long battle with Terra West, evidence of their fraudulent claims, court precedents, names of other landowners who had fought and won, a complete record of everything Dutch had learned about defending this land. Beneath the documents, a map, not the survey map Jack had seen before. This one showed geological features, underground water, aquifer boundaries, and something else, a shaded region covering most of Jack's 40 acres. "What's that?" Jack asked. "Rare earth mineral deposit," Frank said. "Dutch had it surveyed privately 15 years ago, kept the results quiet. That's worth somewhere between $20 and $50 million if extracted." Jack stared at the map, $50 million buried under his feet. "He could have been rich," Jack said. "He chose not to be, chose to leave it untouched. He knew what mining it would do to the aquifer, to the land, to everything he was protecting." Frank pointed to documents in the box. He documented everything, every approach Terra West made, every legal trick, every attempt to force a sale or claim fraudulent rights. Built a case so complete that if they try again, you can bury them. Why didn't he use it? They never pushed hard enough, never forced it to court, just kept probing, testing, waiting for him to die so they could try with whoever came next. Frank looked at Jack directly. That's you now. They will push you harder than they pushed him. They know about the minerals, know about the water, know this is their last chance before the land gets protected status. You need to decide if you are willing to fight. Jack looked at the map, at the wealth buried beneath snow and stone, and 40 acres of Montana wilderness, at the choice his grandfather had made and the choice now being offered to him. Richard's pressure, Margaret's disappointment, Tara West's escalation, Tommy saying legacy mattered more than career, Dutch spending $30,000 in 3 years fighting for land he never profited from. "I'll fight," Jack said. Frank nodded slowly. "Then you will need this." He handed Jack a business card. Michael Reeves, Veterans Land Rights Project, lawyer out of Billings, specializes in helping vets protect property from corporate land grabs. Worked with Dutch before. He will work with you. Jack called Reeves that afternoon, explained the situation. Reeves listened without interrupting. When Jack finished, Reeves said, "Your grandfather was one of the most stubborn men I ever met. Fought for 3 years on principle when he could have sold for profit. You his grandson." "Yes." "Then I'll take the case. But Jack, you need to understand, this will not be quick. It will not be easy. Tara West has unlimited money, political connections, lawyers who will bury you in paperwork. They will try to exhaust you, break you, force you to sell just to make it stop. Can you handle that?" Jack looked around the cabin, at the proof that a man could build what was needed from what was available, at the evidence that endurance was possible, at 40 winters' worth of surviving what should have killed lesser structures. "Yes," Jack said, "I can handle that." "Good. Scan and send me everything in that box Frank gave you. I will review it and we will build our defense. In the meantime, document everything. Every contact with Tara West, every threat, every trespass. We are going to need evidence." Jack spent the evening photographing documents, organizing files, building the case. Outside, January cold settled deeper. Inside, the stove burned steady and warm. His phone buzzed, text from Richard. "Legal team contacted me. Said you refused to cooperate with environmental survey. Said you were hostile and threatening. This is getting out of hand, Jack. Sell before you get sued and lose everything." Jack did not respond, opened another notebook instead, found Dutch's entry from February 2004, the year Tara West had first filed suit. Dutch had written simply that some fights choose you and the only question is whether you stand or run. He had stood, for 3 years, until they withdrew their claim and slunk away defeated. Jack set down the phone, looked at the documents spread across the table, at the map showing $50 million worth of minerals he would never extract, at the choice that was not really a choice. He had already made it the moment he decided to stay. He was not leaving, was not selling, was not backing down. They could come with lawyers, with money, with pressure and threats and every corporate trick they knew. He had something they did not: time, patience, and a cabin that had weathered 40 winters and would weather 40 more. The fight was coming, but Jack Brennan was ready. He added wood to the stove, banked it for the night, lay down on the bunk and listened to wind test the barn walls and the cabin hold firm against all pressure. Tomorrow he would call Elena, would begin building the legal defense, would prepare for the battle Dutch had started and Jack would finish. Tonight he slept without fear, without doubt, without the whiskey that had once been necessary to silence the noise in his head. The cabin held him, the land protected him. His grandfather's voice spoke through decades of documented wisdom telling him that what mattered was not what you owned, but what you refused to sell. Jack understood now, understood completely. This inheritance was not property, it was purpose, and he would defend it with everything he had. The legal notice arrived on January 15th. Certified mail requiring signature. Jack drove to the post office in town, a trip that took 40 minutes on roads still showing patches of ice from the blizzard. The clerk handed him the envelope with a look that said she knew what it contained. Small towns kept no secrets. Terra West Development Corporation versus John Brennan. Formal complaint filed in district court claiming dormant mineral rights under the Homestead Act of 1892, demanding survey access, asserting adverse possession through historical use, requesting preliminary injunction to prevent interference with legitimate business operations. 30 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple message: give us the land or we will take it. Jack read it once in the post office parking lot. Read it again in the truck with the engine running and heat blasting against January cold. Read it a third time back at the cabin with Michael Reeves on speaker phone, explaining what each section meant. They are throwing everything at the wall, Reeves said. Mineral rights claim is garbage. Your grandfather fought that exact argument 20 years ago and won. Adverse possession is even weaker. They have to prove continuous use for statutory period, and they can't. Dutch kicked them off every time they tried. This is intimidation. They want you overwhelmed. Will it work? Depends. Can you handle a year of court appearances, depositions, motions, and legal fees that would bankrupt most people? Jack looked around the cabin, at the life he had built from almost nothing, at the sobriety he had maintained for 3 months, at the purpose that had replaced the drinking. Yes, he said. Good, they are also filing a separate action, competency challenge, trying to have you declared unable to manage the property. That hearing is in 3 weeks. Jack felt something cold that was not winter settle in his chest. On what grounds? PTSD diagnosis, employment history, divorce, the DUI arrest. They are painting you as unstable veteran living in primitive conditions, incapable of rational decision-making regarding valuable property. That's not true. I know, but we have to prove it. In court, in front of a judge who will hear very expensive lawyers say you are incompetent and mentally ill. Can you handle that? Iraq flashed through Jack's mind. Bridges built under fire. Decisions made in seconds that meant life or death. Coming home and finding that civilian life required different skills, ones he did not have, ones that led to bottles and divorce and the long slide into shame. But that was then. This was now. Now he woke sober. Now he worked with purpose. Now he maintained systems that kept him alive through Montana winter. He was not the man those lawyers would describe. Not anymore. I can handle it, Jack said. The next 3 weeks were preparation. Elena Vasquez met with him twice, reviewing documents, building the case for his competence. She was 50s, sharp-eyed, widow of a Marine who had died in Afghanistan, understood veterans, understood land law, understood what Dutch had been protecting. Your grandfather documented everything, she said, spreading papers across her dining room table in town. Every improvement to the property, every system he built, every legal battle. This is not the record of a confused old man. This is engineering documentation, precise, methodical, sane. She looked at Jack over reading glasses. You are continuing his work, living in the cabin, maintaining the systems. That shows respect for what he built. That shows you understand its value. We emphasize that. You are not homeless vagrant. You are property manager living on site. Jack had not thought of it that way, but it was true. He was managing 40 acres, maintaining structures, protecting resources. That was work. That was purpose. Tommy arrived the weekend before the hearing. Took leave he could not really afford to take. drove straight from base still in uniform, coming from duty and having no time to change. He found Jack splitting wood behind the barn, the rhythm of the axe steady and sure. They embraced. Tommy stepped back and looked at his father with an assessment that was both personal and professional. "You look good, Dad," Tommy said. "Better than I have seen you in years." "I feel good. Ready for court. As ready as I can be." Tommy helped split wood, helped repair a section of barn wall that had loosened during the blizzard. They worked in the comfortable silence that had always defined their best moments together. When the work was done, when the sun was setting orange and cold over the mountains, Tommy said what he had come to say. "I am testifying for you. Reeves contacted me, asked if I would. I said yes." Jack stopped moving. "You don't have to do that." "I know, I want to. Uncle Richard called me. Tried to convince me you were having a breakdown. Tried to get me to testify about your drinking, your instability, all of it. I told him to go to hell." "Richard is suing me." "Not directly, but he is supporting Tara West's case. Filed an affidavit saying you are incompetent, saying great-grandpa was senile at the end, trying to invalidate the whole inheritance." Jack felt betrayal like physical weight. His own brother, working with the corporation, trying to take what Dutch had left. "Why?" Jack asked. "Money," Tommy said simply. "Tara West offered him a finder's fee, 10% of whatever they pay for the land. He thinks he is being practical, getting something out of a situation where you are going to lose anyway." "I am not going to lose." Tommy smiled. "I know, that is why I am here." The courthouse was in the county seat. Old building, stone and wood, built in the 1920s when Montana still believed in permanence. The courtroom was smaller than Jack expected. Oak paneling, high windows, benches worn smooth by decades of people seeking justice or avoiding it. Tara West brought 3 lawyers, young, expensive suits, tablets and file boxes, and the kind of confidence that came from never having lost to someone who could not afford to fight back. They set up at their table like an occupying force. Jack's side was smaller, Reeves in a suit that was good but not expensive, Elena beside him as paralegal support, Jack in the only clean clothes he owned that were not work-worn, Tommy in dress uniform, ribbons on his chest, sitting in the gallery behind them. The judge was a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back, eyes that had seen every kind of case this county produced. She reviewed the filings with the careful attention of someone who understood that property disputes in Montana were never simple. Tara West's lead attorney opened. His name was Davis. Harvard law printed on every word choice. He laid out their case with practiced precision. John Brennan, veteran with documented PTSD, history of alcoholism, recent divorce, unemployed, living in structure without modern utilities, refusing reasonable offers for property he could not properly manage. Medical records showed diagnosis. Employment records showed pattern of job loss. Police records showed DUI arrest. This was not competent property owner. This was man in crisis requiring intervention. Davis presented exhibits. Jack's medical file from the VA, divorce decree mentioning substance abuse, employment termination letters, photographs of the barn taken from the road, making it look like condemned structure. He built a narrative of decline and incompetence, each piece of evidence adding to the picture of a man who could not be trusted with valuable property. Then Davis called Richard. Jack watched his brother take the stand. Richard wore suit and tie, looked prosperous and concerned, played the role of worried family member perfectly. He swore to tell the truth. Then he began to dismantle Jack's life in careful sentences. Yes, he was Jack's older brother. Yes, he had known their grandfather well. Yes, He had concerns about both men in their final years. Davis led him through it. Can you describe your grandfather's mental state toward the end of his life? He became increasingly paranoid and isolated, Richard said. Refused reasonable offers for property that was too much for him to maintain, lived in primitive conditions, cut off contact with family, showed signs of dementia and irrational thinking. And your brother Jack? I love my brother, but he has struggled for years. The PTSD from Iraq, the drinking, the divorce. We have tried to help, tried to get him into treatment. He refuses. And now he is living in our grandfather's barn, refusing offers that could change his life, and I think he is continuing a pattern of self-destructive behavior. In your professional opinion, is your brother capable of managing valuable property? No, I think he needs help. I think the court should appoint a conservator who can make rational decisions about the land before Jack destroys what little value remains. Reeves cross-examined, asked when Richard had last visited Dutch before his death, 8 years, asked how often Richard called, maybe twice in 10 years, asked if Richard had any first-hand knowledge of Jack's current condition. No, had not visited the property, had not seen Jack in person since the will reading. So your testimony about your brother's current mental state is based on assumption rather than observation. I know my brother. You knew him, past tense. You have not seen him in months, have not visited his home, have not witnessed how he lives now, correct? Richard's jaw tightened, correct. Reeves introduced phone records, showed Richard had been in contact with Tara West for 6 months, showed he had been offered payment for supporting their case, showed he had financial interest in outcome. You stand to gain if your brother loses this property, true. I am trying to help him by taking away his inheritance and profiting from it. Objection, Davis said, argumentative. Sustained, the judge said, but she was looking at Richard differently now. Tara West called their expert next, psychiatrist who had reviewed Jack's medical records and never met him, testified about PTSD, about how it impaired judgment, about how veterans with untreated trauma often made poor decisions, cited statistics, referenced studies, made it sound clinical and inevitable. Reeves asked one question on cross. Have you examined Mr. Brennan in person? No, but the medical records are clear about his diagnosis and symptoms. So you are rendering professional opinion about a man you have never met based on records that are 3 years old. The diagnosis does not change. People do, though. Recovery happens. Growth happens. You cannot testify about any of that since you have not examined him, can you? The psychiatrist hesitated. No. They broke for lunch. Jack sat on a bench outside the courtroom. Tommy brought him coffee from the machine down the hall. They did not talk about the testimony. Did not need to. Richard's betrayal hung between them like smoke. I am sorry, Tommy said finally. Not your fault. He is family. He should not be doing this. Jack recalled the notebooks. Dutch writing that family was supposed to mean loyalty, but often just meant shared genetics and conflicting interests. How the old man had been estranged from his children and never seemed bothered by it, had built his own life, had found his own measure of what mattered. Family is who stands with you, Jack said, not who shares your blood. Tommy nodded, set his hand on Jack's shoulder, left it there until the bailiff called them back inside. The afternoon session began with Jack's testimony. Reeves walked him through it carefully. Established timeline, Jack's service record, Iraq deployment, bridge engineering, combat experience, return home, struggles with adjustment, the drinking, the divorce, the job losses, not hiding any of it, laying it all out honestly. Then Reeves shifted. "Mr. Brennan, when did you stop drinking?" "November 12th, the day I arrived at my grandfather's property." "How long is that now?" 3 months, 92 days. "What changed?" Jack looked at the judge, spoke directly to her. "I found purpose. My grandfather built something that required maintenance and care. I had been chasing things that did not matter, money, status, trying to prove something to people who were never going to be satisfied. The property showed me different priorities: work, self-reliance, protecting what matters instead of consuming what does not." "You live in a barn," Reeves said, "without electricity or running water. Tara West's lawyers call that incompetent. What do you call it?" "I call it engineered shelter built by a combat veteran who survived worse than Montana winter. My grandfather was POW in Korea, Chosin Reservoir. He applied what he learned there to building the cabin: double wall insulation, thermal mass flooring, efficient heating system. I maintain those systems. They work perfectly. That is not primitive, that is sophisticated." Reeves introduced Jack's engineering background, his Army training, his professional experience, showed he understood technical systems, showed he was applying that knowledge to property management. Davis cross-examined, tried to rattle him, asked about the drinking, about the divorce, about living alone in winter. Jack answered calmly, did not get defensive, did not apologize, just stated facts. "Do you really think you can maintain this property long-term?" Davis asked. "I am maintaining it now." "But for how long? Until the money runs out, until you start drinking again, until winter becomes too hard." "I have been through hard before. Iraq was hard, this is just cold." "You are refusing $250,000 to live in a barn. That is not rational." "That depends on what you value. I value what my grandfather built. I value clean water and protected land. I value not selling out just because someone offers money. That is rational to me." Davis tried several more angles. Jack stayed steady, did not give ground, spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had made peace with his choices. When Jack stepped down, he caught Tommy's eye. His son nodded once. Approval, pride, the kind of recognition Jack had been chasing for years without knowing he was chasing it. Tommy testified next, in uniform, ribbons representing deployments and valor. The visual impact was immediate. This was not unstable veteran. This was Army officer, professional, credible. He testified about visiting Jack in December, about seeing the property, about recognizing the engineering quality of the cabin, about his father's sobriety and focus and clear purpose. "As a fellow veteran and engineer, I can tell you my father is doing exactly what he should be doing. He is applying his training and experience to managing property that has real value, not just monetary value, historical value, environmental value. He is protecting something worth protecting." Davis tried to shake him, asked about Jack's past, about the drinking and the instability. Tommy did not flinch. "My father struggled after deployment. Many veterans do, but he is not that person anymore. I have watched him transform over the past 3 months. He is sober, he is purposeful, he is competent, and he is honoring our great-grandfather's legacy in a way that actually matters." "You are biased," Davis said. "He is your father." "I am honest. I am an Army officer. I swore an oath to truth and integrity. I would not lie to this court for anyone. My father is competent. This case is not about his capability. It is about a corporation wanting land they have no right to." Frank Holloway testified after Tommy, older rancher who had known Dutch 40 years, who had helped hang the barn door in 1978, who had watched the cabin go up board by board, who had seen Dutch fight Tara West before and win. Frank testified about the property's value, about the aquifer, about the water rights, about how Tara West had tried this exact strategy 20 years ago and failed when Dutch had documented everything. Jack Brennan is doing exactly what his grandfather did, Frank said, living on the land, maintaining it, protecting it from people who would destroy it for profit. That is not incompetence. That is stewardship. Reeves introduced Dutch's notebooks, 40 years of documentation, engineering specifications, maintenance logs, legal correspondence, evidence of sound mind and deliberate planning. The judge spent 20 minutes reviewing them. Her expression shifted from neutral to impressed. "These are remarkable," she said. "This is not the work of someone incompetent or confused. This is professional-grade documentation." Reeves also introduced the complete legal file from Dutch's previous battle with Tara West, showed they had claimed the same dormant mineral rights in 1995, showed Dutch had fought them for 3 years, showed court had ruled definitively that the claims were baseless. "They are trying the same strategy again," Reeves said, "hoping that new heir will not know the history, will not have the documentation, will not fight back. But Jack Brennan has all of it, and he is fighting." Davis objected repeatedly, called the old case irrelevant, said circumstances had changed. The judge overruled him each time. Then Reeves called his final witness. Surprise addition to the list filed just 2 days before. Woman in her 40s, professional dress, nervous but determined. She stated her name, Sarah Chen, former geologist for Tara West Development, emphasis on former. Davis stood immediately. Objection. This witness was not disclosed in time for proper preparation. "I filed notice within procedural requirements," Reeves said. "Ms. Chen only came forward 3 days ago. She has relevant testimony." The judge considered. "I will allow it but keep it focused." Sarah Chen testified that she had worked for Tara West for 6 years, had been part of the team that surveyed Jack's property and surrounding area, had been asked to write reports supporting mineral rights claims she knew were false. "The company knew they had no legitimate claim to the minerals," she said. "The geological surveys showed the deposits were entirely under Mr. Brennan's property, no historical extraction, no valid claims under homestead law, but my supervisors told me to write it differently, to make it sound ambiguous, to create legal gray area where none existed." Davis was on his feet. "This is hearsay and speculation from a disgruntled former employee." Sarah pulled out a folder. "I have the original survey data and the edited versions I was told to submit, and emails from supervisors instructing me to misrepresent findings. I resigned when I could not be part of fraud any longer, but I kept evidence." The courtroom went very quiet. Reeves entered the documents into evidence. Emails showing Tara West executives discussing how to manipulate data, how to create justification for claims they knew were false, how to target properties owned by veterans or elderly, people less likely to fight back effectively. One email from Tara West's CEO specifically mentioned Jack. "Recent inheritance, veteran with problems, should be easy to pressure into quick sale. Offer low, increase if necessary, but do not go above 300K. Property worth 10x that if we can get water rights and mineral access." The judge read the email twice. Her expression hardened. Davis tried to recover, questioned Sarah's credibility, her motives for coming forward, suggested she was being paid by Jack's legal team. Sarah remained calm. "I am not being paid. I am testifying because what Tara West is doing is wrong. They target vulnerable people. They use legal system as weapon. They tried it with Mr. Brennan's grandfather, failed. Now they are trying it with him. I will not be part of it anymore. Court adjourned for the day. The judge said she would review evidence overnight and render decision tomorrow morning. Jack walked out into January twilight, cold and clear. Tommy and Frank joined him on the courthouse steps. None of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, Frank said, "That went well." Chen's testimony was unexpected, Reeves said, joining them. "But good, very good. The internal emails are damning." "Will it be enough?" Jack asked. "Tomorrow we find out." Jack spent the night at a motel in town. Could not face the drive back to the property in the dark. Tommy stayed in the next room. They got dinner at a diner that served breakfast all day, sat in a booth under fluorescent lights and picked at food neither was hungry for. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Tommy said, "you fought, that matters." "I learned that from you," Jack said. "Watching you deploy, watching you go back even when it was hard. You showed me what fighting for something looks like." Tommy looked surprised. "I thought I disappointed you, choosing military over civilian career, not settling down." "You chose meaning over money. I spent my whole life doing the opposite. You were wiser than me." They finished dinner in silence, went back to their rooms. Jack lay awake considering Dutch, the old man fighting this same battle 20 years ago, alone. No son to stand beside him, no Tommy to testify, just stubborn refusal to surrender what he had built. Jack was not alone. That made all the difference. Morning came cold and clear. They returned to the courthouse at 9. The judge was already at the bench, having clearly worked through the night reviewing everything. She did not waste time. "I have reviewed all testimony and evidence," she said. "This court finds that John Brennan is competent to manage his property. The medical records show diagnosis of PTSD, but no current evidence of impairment. The testimony from family member Richard Brennan is compromised by financial interest in outcome. The testimony from Thomas Brennan and Frank Holloway is credible and persuasive. The documentary evidence shows Mr. Brennan is successfully maintaining property, using systems his grandfather designed." She looked directly at Tara West's lawyers. "More concerning to this court are the revelations about Tara West Development's practices. The evidence presented by Ms. Chen suggests fraudulent misrepresentation and predatory targeting of vulnerable property owners. I am referring this matter to the State Attorney General for investigation. I am also issuing protective order prohibiting Tara West from any contact with Mr. Brennan or his property pending resolution of the underlying mineral rights dispute." She looked at Jack. "Mr. Brennan, your inheritance is confirmed. The property and all rights thereto belong to you. You have demonstrated both competence to manage it and commitment to protecting it. This court sees no reason to appoint conservator or restrict your property rights in any way." The gavel came down. Jack sat very still, felt Tommy's hand on his shoulder, heard Frank exhale in relief, watched Tara West's lawyers pack their tablets and files in tight silence. Richard was gone, had left during the judge's statement, could not face what he had done or what it had failed to accomplish. Outside the courthouse, news crews waited, local station, regional paper. Word had spread about the whistleblower testimony and corporate fraud angle. They wanted comment. Jack gave none. Just walked to his truck with Tommy and Frank flanking him. But before he reached the vehicle, a reporter called out a question that made him stop. "Mr. Brennan, you refused $250,000 to live in a barn. Why?" Jack turned, looked at the cameras, reflected on everything Dutch had taught him through 40 years of documented wisdom, considered what actually mattered when everything else was stripped away. Some things are worth more than money, Jack said. My grandfather understood that. Took me 52 years to learn it. He drove back to the property in silence, Tommy following in the rental SUV, Frank in his own truck, a small convoy of people who understood what had been won and what it had cost. The cabin was exactly as he had left it, stove cold but ready to light, stone floor waiting to absorb heat, walls standing firm against whatever winter could deliver. Jack built a fire, made coffee, sat at the table where Dutch had sat for 4 decades and felt the weight of responsibility settle into something closer to peace. Tommy appeared in the doorway. "Dad, I have been thinking." "Yeah. My contract ends in 4 months. I am getting out like I said, and I want to come here, help you build this into something, not development, something that honors what great-grandpa started." Jack looked at his son, at the future suddenly visible in a way it had not been before. "What did you have in mind?" "Veterans Workshop. Guys like us who need time away from noise. Teach them what great-grandpa taught you, how to build, how to work metal, how to live with less, how to find peace." Jack considered it, the property that could hold more than one cabin, the knowledge worth passing forward, legacy that was not about money but about meaning. "We would need to build carefully," Jack said. "Keep it simple, sustainable. The way great-grandpa would have done it." "Yeah, the way he would have done it." They spent the evening planning, sketching ideas in notebook margins, talking about what could be built, what should be preserved, how to create space for healing without turning it into business, how to make it work on almost nothing when almost nothing was what they had. Frank came by at dusk, brought a bottle that he set on the table unopened. "For celebrating," he said, "but only if you want it." Jack looked at the bottle, felt nothing. No pull, no need, just glass containing liquid that had once controlled him and no longer did. "Save it for someone who drinks," Jack said. Frank smiled, took the bottle back. "Dutch would be proud of you." "I hope so." "He is, wherever he is. He knew what he was doing leaving you this place. Knew you would figure it out eventually. Knew you had it in you to stand when others would fold." After Frank left, after Tommy went to bed in the bunk they shared, Jack sat by the stove and opened the final notebook, the one dated 2023, Dutch's last year. The entries were shorter, weaker handwriting, man facing the end and knowing it, but the voice was the same, clear, purposeful, unafraid. The final entry was dated 1 week before Dutch entered hospice. Before the family moved him away from the property he had built and protected and loved. He wrote that he was ready to go, had lived 84 years, had survived war and imprisonment and loss and cold, had built something that lasted, had protected land that mattered, had left it to the one person he believed would understand why it mattered. He wrote that legacy was not about possessions or money or status, was about passing forward what you learned, about making sure knowledge did not die with you, about preparing the next person to stand where you stood and hold what you held. He wrote that he believed in Jack, always had, even when Jack did not believe in himself, saw in him the patience and the stubbornness and the refusal to accept defeat that made survival possible, knew that if Jack found his way to this cabin, found his way to these notebooks, he would become who he was meant to be. The last line was simple. "The forge still burns, the work continues. The land endures, stand firm, Jack, you have everything you need." Jack closed the notebook, set it carefully with the others, added wood to the stove and watched flames build and strengthen, considered tomorrow and the day after and the season ahead, winter deepening, spring eventually coming, work always waiting. He had won in court, but that was not the real victory. The real victory was waking sober, was maintaining systems, was finding purpose in protecting what mattered, was becoming the man his grandfather believed he could be. Outside, Montana winter night settled over the land, clear and cold and full of stars. Inside, the cabin held firm. The stone floor radiated stored warmth. The walls stood against all pressure. Jack Brennan sat in the space his grandfather had built and felt at home for the first time in years. The fight was over, but the real work was just beginning. Winter released its grip slowly. February became March and the snow began its retreat, leaving behind brown grass and mud that would take weeks to dry. The days lengthened by increments Jack measured in when he woke and when darkness fell. Light returning, cold easing, spring approaching in the patient way that Montana spring always did, never rushed, never certain, but inevitable. Jack marked his 4th month of sobriety on March 12th. Noted it in the journal he had started keeping, following his grandfather's example. Simple entries, weather, work completed, systems maintained, nothing dramatic, just the accumulation of days lived with purpose. 121 days without a drink. The number itself meant less than what it represented. Mornings waking clear-headed, hands steady, mind focused on tasks that mattered. The legal aftermath unfolded in ways that felt distant from the cabin. Alina called with updates. The Attorney General had opened investigation into Terra West. Federal authorities were reviewing the whistleblower evidence. The mineral rights lawsuit had been dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. The company was facing potential criminal charges for fraud and predatory practices. Their stock had dropped 40%. 3 executives had resigned. Jack listened to these updates with mild interest. It was happening somewhere else to people he did not know. What mattered was here. The barn, the cabin, the land, the systems that needed maintaining regardless of corporate consequences or legal victories. The letter arrived in late March. Law office letterhead but different firm. Montana Land Conservancy. Non-profit organization dedicated to protecting open space and working lands. They had heard about his case, were interested in discussing conservation easement on his property. Jack drove to town to meet with their representative. Woman named Catherine Miller, mid-50s, weathered in the way that people who spent time outdoors weathered. She wore practical clothes and carried maps and spoke without unnecessary language. Your property sits on critical aquifer recharge area, she said, spreading topographic maps on the diner table. Headwaters for 3 river systems. Habitat corridor for elk and deer. Your grandfather understood this. Tried to establish easement 10 years ago, but title was unclear with Terra West's claims. Now title is clear. We would like to try again. She explained the structure. Conservation easement permanently restricted development while Jack retained ownership. He could live there, could build structures for agricultural or conservation purposes, could pass property to heirs, but it could never be subdivided or commercially developed or mined. The land would be protected in perpetuity. In exchange, the Conservancy would pay $100,000 up front plus $5,000 annually for stewardship and monitoring. Tax benefits would reduce his property tax burden to almost nothing. Jack studied the maps, saw his 40 acres outlined in green, saw the larger ecosystem it connected to, saw what his grandfather had been protecting. I need time to think about it, he said. Catherine nodded. Take the time you need, but know that your grandfather wanted this. He believed this land should never be touched, should remain wild and clean for people who come after. This easement makes that permanent. Jack carried the documents back to the cabin, read them by lamplight, understood that this was not just legal protection. This was final answer to the question of what the land was for, not for profit, not for extraction, for enduring. He signed the papers 3 days later. Tommy came in April, not visiting this time, moving. His truck loaded with everything he owned, which, like Jack, was not much. Duffel bags, footlocker, tools, books. The possessions of someone who had learned to live without excess. They stood together looking at the property with new eyes, not just as place to maintain, but as place to build. Tommy had sketched plans during his final weeks on base. Second cabin using Dutch's design principles. Workshop expansion. Simple structures that honored the original engineering while creating space for others. "We start small," Tommy said. "One cabin this summer, see if the model works, if veterans actually want what we are offering." "Which is what exactly?" Jack asked. "Time, space, work that matters. A place where PTSD is understood instead of judged, where being quiet is fine, where building things with your hands is therapy without calling it therapy." They broke ground in May, used techniques from Dutch's notebooks, positioned the second cabin to maximize southern exposure, dug foundation by hand, selected site that would work with land rather than forcing land to accommodate structure. Slow work, deliberate, done right simply because there was no reason to do it wrong. Frank came by weekly, brought lumber he had salvaged or purchased at auction, brought hardware, brought sandwiches his wife made and beer he drank while Jack and Tommy drank water, never mentioned the beer, never made it awkward, just accepted that Jack did not drink and moved on. One evening in June, sitting on the cabin step watching sunset paint the mountains orange and purple, Frank said what he had been holding for months. "I need to tell you something about your grandfather and why he left you this place." Jack waited. "That last year when Dutch was sick, he came to me, asked me to watch whoever inherited the property, said if they lasted one winter, truly lasted without selling or running, they were worthy. If they did not last, I was to buy the land myself and protect it the way he had." Frank looked at Jack directly. "He was testing you, the whole time, the cabin, the notebooks, the hidden money, all of it designed to see if you would stay or fold. He believed you would stay, but he needed to know." Jack absorbed this. The old man had engineered the inheritance the way he engineered the cabin, with multiple redundancies, backup plans, nothing left to chance. "Why are you telling me now? You passed, more than passed, you fought for it, you built on it. You are becoming what he hoped you would become. He would be proud. I wanted you to know that." The first veteran arrived in July. Referral from VA counselor who had heard about the project through informal networks. Marine, Afghanistan, 3 deployments, PTSD diagnosis, homeless for 6 months. Name was Marcus, 42 years old and looked 60. Jack and Tommy showed him the second cabin, nearly complete now, showed him the forge, explained there were no rules except respect the land and do not bring substances that would harm recovery. No therapy sessions, no mandatory anything, just work and quiet and time. Marcus stayed 3 days, then a week, then 2 weeks, helped finish the cabin he was sleeping in, learned to split wood properly, started talking in fragments about Helmand Province, about IEDs, about coming home to nothing. The talking came easier when his hands were busy, when there was no pressure to perform recovery. August brought 2 more. Army, different wars, same patterns. Jack recognized them, having been them himself, saw his own reflection in their careful movements and startled reactions to unexpected sounds, gave them space, gave them work, gave them example of man who had been broken and found way to rebuild. The workshop model emerged organically. Morning work, maintenance tasks, building projects. Afternoon was free time. Some men fished in the creek that ran through the property. Some walked. Some sat in silence. Evening meal together, simple food cooked on the outdoor fire pit Tommy had built. Conversation if it came, silence if it did not. No one pushed. No one demanded. No one asked questions that were too hard to answer. Just presence and acceptance, and understanding that healing was not linear and could not be scheduled. By September, they had housed 12 men. Some stayed days, some stayed weeks, 2 stayed months and were still there. The cabins were always full. The word spread through veteran networks. Place in Montana, run by vets. No bullshit, just work and time and something that felt like peace. Money was tight. The conservancy payment had covered materials but not much else. Jack used what remained of Dutch's hidden cash carefully. Tommy contributed his army savings. They lived on almost nothing, ate simply, built slowly, trusted that sustainability meant spending less than came in. Frank helped connect them with local ranchers who donated beef, with hardware store owner who gave them contractor pricing, with feed supply that provided dented bags of grain at discount. Small town network that understood veterans helping veterans and wanted to support it. Richard never called again. After the trial, after his testimony failed to achieve what he had hoped, he simply vanished from Jack's life. No apology, no explanation, just absence where there had been brother. Jack felt surprisingly little about it. Some relationships were not worth repairing. Margaret was different. Her letter came in October, handwritten, 3 pages. She wrote that she was sorry, that she had believed Richard when he said Jack was incompetent, that she had been wrong to pressure him to sell, that she had spent months considering what family should mean and realizing she had measured it wrong. She wrote that their grandfather had tried to teach them things they were not ready to learn, about value that could not be sold, about legacy that was not inheritance, about choosing meaning over comfort. She had dismissed it as old man nonsense. Now she saw it differently. She enclosed photograph from the 1960s, young Dutch at the forge, her brother Jack's father as a boy learning to work metal. She had written on the back, "Dad tried to teach all of us. Only you listened." Jack read the letter twice, set it aside, picked it up again days later, finally wrote back. Brief note. Said he appreciated her honesty. Said the door was not closed but trust had to be rebuilt. Said if she wanted to visit she would be welcome. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. November brought cold and the start of Jack's second winter. The difference from first winter was profound. Then he had been alone, uncertain, newly sober, testing whether he could survive. Now the property held 5 men, systems proven, routines established, purpose clear. Not surviving, thriving. The veterans who stayed helped with winter preparation, stocked firewood, sealed gaps, organized supplies, work that gave them ownership, made them part of something rather than recipients of charity. Jack watched them find the same rhythms he had found, hands becoming steadier, sleep becoming deeper, the particular peace that came from physical work in cold air. Tommy had grown into his role, natural teacher, patient with men who struggled, firm when necessary. He ran the forge classes, taught basic metalworking, watched men who had not created anything in years shape hot metal into tools or hooks or simple beauty, watched pride return to faces that had forgotten what pride felt like. December brought decision Jack had been avoiding. Mining company, different from Terra West, had approached through proper channels. Legitimate offer for mineral extraction, rare earth elements, new techniques that minimized environmental impact. They presented studies, engineering reports, promised restoration. The offer was substantial. $5 million upfront plus 20% royalty on extraction. 10-year operation, money that could fund the workshop forever, could help thousands of veterans, could change lives. Jack spent weeks studying the proposal, read every page, understood the engineering, saw that impact would actually be minimal. New methods were remarkably clean. The company was reputable. The money was real. He called meeting with Tommy and Frank, spread the documents on the cabin table. "This is legitimate," Jack said. "They are not lying about impact. This would work." Tommy studied the numbers. "This would fund operations for decades. We could expand, help hundreds of men." Frank said nothing, just watched Jack. "But," Jack said. "But it changes why we are here," Tommy finished. "Changes what this place means." Jack nodded. Once money like that existed, it would influence decisions, would create pressure to grow, to expand, to become organization instead of mission. The simplicity that made the workshop work would disappear under weight of funding and expectations and reporting requirements. And deeper than that, Dutch had known this deposit existed, had known its worth, had chosen poverty over extraction, had protected the land at cost of comfort and family approval and everything society said made life worth living, had died protecting it. To mine it now would say Dutch was wrong, would say money mattered more than principle, would convert his sacrifice into missed opportunity. "We say no," Jack said. $5 million, Tommy said. "You are sure?" "I am sure." Frank smiled. "Dutch knew you would choose right." The mining company received polite decline. They raised the offer, doubled it, offered better terms. Jack declined each time. Finally, they stopped calling. Margaret visited in January, drove up from Denver, nervous, uncertain of welcome. Jack showed her the property, the cabins, the workshop, introduced her to the veterans staying there, showed her Dutch's notebooks preserved in protective sleeves. She cried reading them. "I never knew, never understood what he built or why it mattered. We just saw poor old man in barn and thought he had failed at life." "He succeeded at different life than you were measuring," Jack said. She stayed 2 days, helped cook, talked with the veterans, saw what Jack and Tommy had created. When she left, she hugged Jack tight, said she would come back if that was okay. Jack said it was. Time moved differently now. Not the desperate counting of sober days or the fearful anticipation of next crisis. Just seasons turning, work continuing, men arriving broken and leaving less broken, small victories that accumulated into something larger. Spring returned and they built third cabin. Summer brought more veterans. Fall meant harvest from garden they had planted, food that reduced expenses, connected them to land in new way. Second winter found the property holding 8 men comfortably, systems proven, model working. Year 3 brought recognition they had not sought. Article in military magazine about the workshop. NPR story. Requests for interviews Jack declined. He was not interested in attention, interested only in the work. But the attention brought donations. Small amounts from veterans who understood, larger amounts from foundations that funded veteran programs. Money Jack accepted carefully, spent deliberately, saved mostly. Built small endowments so the workshop would survive beyond him. Tommy got married in the summer of year 3. Woman named Sarah, Army nurse he had met at base before discharge. They married in simple ceremony beside the barn. 20 people attended. Veterans from workshop, Frank, Alina, Margaret, judge from the trial who had become friend. No Richard. His absence was acceptance by both sides that some distances were too far. Tommy and Sarah moved into the second cabin, started talking about children, about raising them here, about teaching them what Dutch had taught Jack and Jack had taught Tommy, legacy continuing forward. Frank died quietly in his sleep in October of year 3, 70 years old, rancher until the end. His funeral packed the small church in town. Jack gave eulogy. spoke about man who had been loyal friend to Dutch and generous neighbor to Jack, who had protected the land and the people on it, who had understood what mattered. Franks will left his ranch to Conservation Trust, left personal note to Jack, simple words. You stood firm, Dutch was right about you, keep standing. Jack kept the note in his wallet, read it sometimes when doubt crept in, reminder that he had been tested and had not failed. Year 4 brought the discovery Jack had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. March afternoon, checking foundation of original cabin, he found the loose board, moved it aside, found space he had somehow missed in all his previous searching. Metal box inside, smaller than the others, wrapped in oilcloth. He carried it to the table, opened it carefully. Single notebook, unmarked cover, Dutch's handwriting, dated entries from final weeks before hospice. The writing was weaker but still clear. Jack read by lamplight as evening fell, read his grandfather's last words. Dutch had written knowing these would be final entries, had written knowing Jack would find them when he was ready, wrote about legacy, about what it meant to leave something that would outlast the body that created it. He wrote that the cabin was not the legacy, the forge was not the legacy, the land itself was not the legacy. Those were just things. Things wore out, things could be destroyed. Real legacy was knowledge, principles, example of how to live when everything tried to pull you toward easier compromises. He wrote that he had watched Jack as boy and seen potential everyone else missed, saw patience in child who would sit watching metal heat without complaining, saw attention in young hands that wanted to learn technique correctly, saw core of strength that life had not yet tested. He wrote that he knew Jack would face tests, war would test him, civilian life would test him, loss and addiction and shame would test him. Dutch had faced same tests, knew the patterns, knew that some men broke and some men bent and some men found way to be tempered by heat into something stronger. He wrote that the inheritance was not gift, was challenge. Could Jack survive what would kill softer men? Could he rebuild what had broken down? Could he find in himself what Dutch had found in Korean snow and Montana cold? The ability to endure, to adapt, to refuse defeat even when defeat looked reasonable. The final entry was addressed directly to Jack. If you are reading this, you stayed, you fought, you built, you became who I always knew you could be. The cabin kept you alive, the work kept you sober, the land taught you value. Now you teach others. This is what legacy means, not what you own, what you pass forward. The forge still burns because you tend it. The knowledge lives because you apply it. The land endures because you protect it. This is enough. This is everything. You honored what I built. Now build what is yours to build. Teach what is yours to teach. Stand firm against what is yours to resist. I am proud of you, Jack. I always was. I just needed you to become proud of yourself. The work continues. The inheritance is fulfilled. Your grandfather believed in you when you did not believe in yourself. Now believe. Jack read the words 3 times, set the notebook down, sat in silence as darkness completed its claim on the world outside. The stove burned low. The cabin held its warmth. Everything Dutch had built still functioning, still doing the work it was designed to do. Jack reflected on the man he had been, drunk, divorced, broken, ashamed, considered the journey from that to this. 4 years of sobriety, 4 years of purpose, 4 years of becoming who he should have been all along. Dutch had been right. The cabin had kept him alive, but more than alive, had given him framework for rebuilding, had shown him that man could survive what should destroy him if he built right systems and maintained them and refused to surrender to easy paths. Year 5 began with formal establishment of Brennan Veterans Land Trust, legal structure protecting property in perpetuity. Board of trustees including Tommy, Alina, 3 veterans who had stayed long-term. Mission statement simple: protect land, serve veterans, pass knowledge forward. The trust owned the property now. Jack lived on it, managed it, but could never sell it, could never develop it, could only maintain and protect and use it for purposes Dutch would have approved. Tommy and Sarah had daughter in spring of year 5, named her Dutch. Not traditional girl's name, but meaningful to them. To Jack, the old man's legacy carried in child who would grow up on this land, who would learn these lessons, who would understand why some things were worth more than money. Jack held his granddaughter on the cabin step, watched her look around with new eyes at world that was normal to her. Barn and forge and mountains and space. She would never know what city noise felt like, would never understand why anyone would choose comfort over this. He considered generational knowledge, Dutch teaching him teaching Tommy, Tommy teaching Dutch the younger, line extending forward, each generation adding to what came before, building on foundation that kept getting stronger. The workshop had served 96 veterans by end of year 5. Some stayed days, some stayed months. 2 stayed permanently, built their own cabins, became part of the permanent community. Small success by institutional measures, massive success by measures that mattered. Jack was 57 now, gray in his beard, weathered by 5 Montana winters, hands scarred from forge work and construction, body harder than it had been at 52, mind clearer than it had been in decades. He stood in the forge on morning in late April, year 6 beginning, metal glowing orange in the coals, hammer in his hand, creating door hardware for 4th cabin, work he had done 100 times now, work that still required attention, still demanded respect. The rhythm of hammer on anvil, ancient sound, unchanged by centuries. He was connected in this moment to every blacksmith who had ever worked metal, to Dutch at this same forge, to men in medieval workshops and ancient furnaces, all of them shaping heat and force into something useful. Veteran named David watching from doorway, new arrival, weak at the property, still figuring out if he would stay or run. Jack had been same way once, uncertain, testing whether this was real or just another program that would disappoint. "Can I try?" David asked. Jack stepped back, handed him the hammer, showed him how to hold it, how to read the metal color, how to strike with purpose, watched him make first awkward hits, then find rhythm, then create something. This was the work, not the metal, the teaching, the passing forward, the proving that broken men could shape new forms if given right tools and enough time. Evening came. Jack walked the property boundaries, 5 years of footsteps on paths he had worn into the earth, checking fence lines, observing elk herd that bedded in the north meadow, watching light fade over mountains that had been here long before him and would remain long after. He reached the stone Dutch had placed 40 years ago, property corner marker, weathered, permanent. Jack had added his own marker beside it 3 years back, simple cairn, stones gathered from the land, no inscription needed. This was where Dutch had stood, where Jack stood now, where Tommy would stand, where little Dutch would stand someday, where men who came here broken would stand and remember they could still stand. The land did not care about their struggles, did not offer sympathy, just offered itself, space to work, time to heal, example of endurance, mountains that survived ice ages, rivers that cut through stone, pines that grew in soil too thin for farming, all of it teaching same lesson. Persist, adapt, build what is needed, protect what matters, pass it forward. Jack returned to the cabin as the last light faded. Tommy had started fire. Sarah was cooking. Little Dutch asleep in cradle Tommy had built from plans in the notebooks. Three veterans sitting at the expanded table. Quiet conversation about tomorrow's work. Normal evening. Nothing special, everything special. Jack added wood to the fire, accepted plate of food, sat with his family and the family he had chosen, ate in comfortable silence. Later, after others had gone to their cabins, after Tommy and Sarah had taken Dutch to bed, Jack sat alone by the stove. Opened the journal he kept now, documented the day, weather, work, progress. Then added entry that was not documentation. 5 years since I arrived here drunk and broken. 5 years since I found Dutch's life work and almost sold it for money I did not need. 5 years since I chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. I am sober, I am purposeful, I am at peace. The cabin still stands, the forge still burns, the land still endures. Dutch's inheritance was not property, was not money, was test and teaching and trust that I would become who I was capable of being. I think I did, I think I am. The work continues, the legacy grows, the knowledge passes forward. This is enough, this is everything. He closed the journal, added wood to stove, checked that all systems were functioning, the cabin holding temperature, the ventilation drawing properly, the stone floor radiating stored warmth. Everything working as designed, as Dutch had promised, as 5 winters had proven. Jack lay on the bunk, his bunk now, his home, his life built from ruins of old life, built on foundation engineered by man who had survived worse and shown the way forward. Outside, spring night settled over Montana wilderness, wind through pines, creek running high with snowmelt, elk calling in the darkness, land alive and enduring and indifferent to human struggle. Inside, the cabin held firm against all pressure, walls built to last, systems proven, legacy secured. Jack closed his eyes, listened to the sounds of home, felt sleep coming easy and clean, felt gratitude for hard path that had led here, for grandfather who had believed when no one else did, for son who had chosen to stand beside him, for land that had taught him what mattered. Tomorrow would bring work, would bring veterans who needed what this place offered, would bring maintenance and teaching and the slow, patient building of something that would outlast them all. But tonight there was just this, peace, purpose, the forge banked but ready to burn, the inheritance not squandered but honored, the test passed, the man rebuilt. The blacksmith's testament fulfilled. Morning would come soon enough, cold and clear and full of possibility. Jack Brennan would wake to it sober and certain and ready for whatever needed building. The land would endure, the work would continue, the legacy would grow. And the forge would burn as long as there were hands willing to tend it, and hearts willing to learn what fire and pressure and patient shaping could create from what seemed permanently broken. This was enough. This was everything. This was home,